I gave my father my left kidney to save his life. The recovery took 9 agonizing weeks. But at our celebratory family dinner, my mother raised her glass and toasted my younger brother for organizing the medical fundraiser. No one looked at me. I stood up to leave, but my father suddenly grabbed my wrist. His eyes were wet. He slid a crumpled napkin across the table with a scribbled warning that would force me to destroy my own family. I am Conrad. I am 69 years old and a retired forensic accountant. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my brother's life piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in your own family and had to fight for your own survival. The dining room of my mother's house was suffocatingly warm. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, trying to ignore the sharp stabbing pain radiating from my left side. The surgical incision from the kidney extraction was still healing. I could feel a fresh wave of warmth as the wound seeped slightly, the dampness pressing heavily against my cotton undershirt. I adjusted my posture, biting the inside of my cheek to keep my expression completely blank. At the head of the table sat my mother, Martha. She was 86 years old and still possessed the sharp tongue of an absolute dictator. She tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver spoon, demanding the immediate attention of the room. Her eyes bypassed me entirely and locked onto my younger brother, Kendall. Kendall was 65, wore a custom-tailored suit to a Sunday family dinner, and possessed the smooth, practiced smile of a career con artist. Beside him sat his wife, Gretchen. She was a wealthy white woman who looked at our family as if we were a neighborhood charity project she was forced to sponsor. My mother beamed at Kendall. She raised her glass high. "I want to make a toast to my youngest son," she announced, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Kendall, you organized the medical fundraiser. You rallied the community. You raised $400,000 and you saved your father's life. We owe you everything." The table erupted in polite applause. Kendall offered a humble nod, placing his hand over his heart in a display of sickening false modesty. Gretchen patted his shoulder proudly. Not a single person mentioned the surgery. Not a single person mentioned that the kidney currently keeping my 89-year-old father alive had been carved directly out of my own body. I sat in silence. I did not demand recognition. I knew my role in this family. I was the workhorse. Kendall was the golden child. Then Gretchen leaned across the table toward me. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a small, glossy piece of cardboard. She slid it toward my dinner plate with a look of overwhelming pity. "Conrad," she said softly, making absolutely sure the entire table was listening. "We know you have been out of work during your little hospital stay. Kendall and I wanted to help you out. It is a $50 voucher for the discount grocery store downtown. Please make sure you buy some fresh vegetables. You look terribly pale." The room went dead silent. A $50 grocery voucher, given to a man who had just sacrificed an organ presented by a woman wearing a $10,000 gold watch. The insult was so deliberate, so perfectly calculated, that it almost impressed me. My mother nodded in approval, praising Gretchen for her charity. Kendall looked down at his plate, hiding a smirk. They expected an explosion. They wanted me to yell, to throw the voucher across the room, to look like the bitter, jealous older brother. They wanted to justify their lifelong disdain for me. But I did not give them the satisfaction. I spent 40 years of my life tracking hidden assets, dismantling corporate frauds, and destroying arrogant men who thought they were untouchable. I do not react to emotion. I react to data. I looked at the $50 voucher resting next to my dinner plate. I picked it up slowly, folded it perfectly in half, and slipped it into my suit pocket. "Thank you, Gretchen," I said. My voice was a flat, unwavering line. "That is incredibly generous of you." The disappointment on her face was immediate. She had cast her line, but I refused to take the bait. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. The pain in my side flared violently, but I kept my back completely straight. I looked at my mother. I told her I was feeling fatigued and needed to rest. She waved her hand dismissively, clearly relieved that the dark cloud of the family was finally leaving her perfect dinner party. As I turned to walk away, I felt a sudden tight grip on my right wrist. I looked down. My father, Ellis, was staring up at me. He had barely spoken a word since the surgery. He looked frail, his skin ashen, but his grip was surprisingly strong. His eyes were red and wet with unshed tears. He did not speak. Instead, his trembling fingers slid a crumpled white linen napkin across the tablecloth, pushing it directly under my hand. I took the napkin, concealing it in my palm instantly. I gave my father a single brief nod. I walked out of the dining room, retrieved my coat from the hallway closet, and stepped out into the cold night air. I did not open the napkin until I was sitting safely inside my car, the doors locked and the engine running. I smoothed out the wrinkled fabric against the steering wheel and turned on the overhead light. The handwriting was shaky, written hastily with a black pen. It read, "We received a report. Kendall drained the accounts." I stared at the words. The air in the car suddenly felt very thin. The $400,000 raised on the public platform was supposed to go directly into my father's hospital billing account to cover the transplant surgery and the specialized post-operative care. That was the strict agreement. I put the car in drive and drove straight home. I did not speed. I did not rage. The cold mechanical part of my brain had fully taken over. Every forensic investigation begins with a single discrepancy, a thread that looks slightly out of place. My brother was a sloppy man who relied on charm rather than intelligence. If he had stolen the money, he would have left a paper trail. I walked into my dark living room, ignoring the throbbing pain in my side. I went straight to my home office, turned on my desktop computer, and pulled out my father's thick medical file. As the designated organ donor and family accountant, I had set up the hospital billing portal myself. I typed in my father's credentials. I entered the password. Access denied. I paused. I retyped the password, pressing each key with deliberate force. Access denied. Error code 7. Account locked. I leaned closer to the bright monitor. The system displayed a brief automated message indicating that the primary contact email for the billing account had been changed. The portal was now linked to a secondary external email address. I recognized the domain name immediately. It was the web address of a shell corporation Kendall had set up 3 years ago for a failed commercial real estate venture. Kendall had not just changed the password. He had completely hijacked the financial authority over my father's medical care. I opened a new browser tab and logged into the public fundraising page. The campaign was marked as completed and fully withdrawn. The total amount raised was exactly $412,000. I picked up my desk phone and dialed the 24-hour emergency billing hotline for the hospital network. After 10 agonizing minutes on hold, a weary representative finally answered the call. I provided my father's name, my own identification number, and requested an immediate balance verification for the transplant procedure. I expected the woman to tell me the account was paid in full. I expected her to say the charity money had been safely deposited. Instead, I heard her type rapidly on her keyboard before she let out a heavy sigh. "Sir, the total outstanding balance for the surgery and the hospital stay is $250,000. The account is severely delinquent. Because of the lack of payment, it has been legally converted into a high-interest medical lien." I stopped breathing for a second. The charity money never reached the hospital. Kendall had pocketed nearly $500,000 of donations meant to save our father, but that was not the worst part of the discovery. The representative cleared her throat, her voice dropping to a serious tone. She told me that the guarantor on the medical lien, the person legally responsible for the entire $250,000 debt, was not my father. It was not Kendall. She read the name on the screen. It was me. My brother had forged my signature. I hung up the phone without another word. The plastic receiver clicked into the base with a hollow sound that seemed to echo endlessly in the quiet darkness of my home office. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair and watched the cold morning sun slowly rise over the city skyline. The physical pain radiating from my left side was a dull and persistent ache, but it was nothing compared to the icy fury rapidly settling deep into my chest. By 8 in the morning, I was already dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit. The clothes hung a little looser on my frame since the surgery, but the thick fabric acted as a necessary armor. I walked out to my car and drove directly to the massive Metropolitan Hospital complex where my father and I had been admitted just weeks earlier. I walked straight past the crowded main lobby and navigated the labyrinth of sterile white corridors until I reached the administrative billing wing. The waiting area was packed with anxious families clutching thick stacks of medical bills, but I bypassed the queue entirely. I approached the heavy bulletproof glass window of the supervisor desk. A young clerk with tired eyes and a rumpled tie asked me to take a numbered ticket from the dispenser. I ignored his request. Instead, I slid my state-issued driver license and my official National Organ Donor Registry card under the narrow glass slot. I told him I needed the complete and itemized physical ledger for my father's transplant surgery immediately. The clerk frowned and typed my name lazily into his computer terminal. After a few seconds, he shook his head and pushed my cards back toward me. He stated that the account was strictly restricted by the primary contact. He told me with a dismissive tone that I had no legal authorization to view any financial records associated with the patient. I leaned closer to the glass until my breath fogged the surface. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady. I informed him that under the specific provisions of federal patient privacy laws, an organ donor possesses the absolute legal right to audit the direct billing of the specific medical procedure involving their extracted tissue. I told him he had exactly 2 minutes to print the entire unredacted file before I contacted the State Medical Board and the Federal Department of Health to report a severe compliance violation that would cost him his job and the hospital a massive fine. The clerk blinked rapidly. He looked at my unblinking stare and swallowed hard. Without another word, he turned to the heavy-duty printer behind him. He printed a 70-page document and pushed the thick manila folder through the slot. I took the folder without thanking him and walked down the hall to an empty table in the quietest corner of the hospital cafeteria. I opened the heavy file. The sharp scent of fresh ink and cheap recycled paper hit my nose. For 40 years, I made my living as a senior forensic accountant for a massive international firm. I spent 4 decades hunting down corporate embezzlers. I unraveled complex money laundering schemes designed by absolute geniuses. I tracked millions of dollars hidden in offshore accounts by ruthless executives who thought they were entirely untouchable. Numbers do not lie. They leave an undeniable trail that arrogance always fails to erase. I ran my index finger down the long columns of dense medical codes and exorbitant billing charges. The noisy cafeteria around me completely faded away. My mind shifted seamlessly into the cold, analytical gear that had built my entire reputation. I traced the precise timeline of the hospital charges. I noted the date of the surgery. I calculated the cost of the operating room, the specialized surgical team, the intensive care unit fees, and the insanely expensive anti-rejection medications. The total balance at the bottom of page 40 was exactly $250,000. But the corresponding column showing incoming payments was completely blank. Not a single cent of the $400,000 Kendall had raised from the sympathetic community was ever transferred to the hospital. The billing department had issued 3 separate formal warnings for severe non-payment. Instead of simply settling the balance with the charity funds, Kendall had authorized the hospital financial department to convert the massive medical debt into a third-party collection lien. This was not a standard manageable payment plan designed for struggling families. It was a predatory, high-interest medical lien specifically designed to attach itself to physical assets and bleed the debtor dry. I looked closely at the interest rate printed in fine print at the bottom of the page, 18% compounding annually. The debt was mathematically structured to balloon out of control within a few short years. Kendall had effectively placed a ticking financial time bomb directly underneath my family while presenting himself to the world as our ultimate savior. But the most horrifying revelation was not the missing money or the predatory interest rate. It was the legal structure of the liability itself. I turned to the final page of the thick contract. It was the primary guarantor agreement. This was the specific legal document that bound an individual to pay the entire $250,000 debt if the primary patient defaulted. My father was 89 years old and possessed absolutely no liquid assets, so the hospital legally required a financially solvent guarantor before they would even schedule the surgery. I looked down at the signature line at the very bottom of the page. There was my name signed in dark black ink. Conrad. It was a flawless, absolute forgery. The sharp loops of the letters were exactly how I wrote them. The slight aggressive slant at the end of the signature was captured perfectly. Kendall had not just guessed my handwriting. He had studied it obsessively. He had likely dug through the old tax returns I prepared for the family years ago to trace my exact pen strokes over and over until he perfected the muscle memory. The sheer, calculated malice of his actions took my breath away. My own brother had used my physical body to save our father. He had stolen the massive amount of charity money meant to pay for that medical salvation. And then he had legally shackled me to the crushing debt of the very procedure that cost me my organ. If I defaulted on this forged lien, the aggressive collection agency would have the absolute legal right to freeze my bank accounts, garnish my pension, seize my retirement funds, and even place a foreclosure hold on my house. Kendall was walking around town with nearly $500,000 in tax-free cash, playing the role of the devoted and heroic son. Meanwhile, I was $250,000 in debt, sitting in a hospital cafeteria and physically bleeding through my undershirt. I stared at the forged signature for a long time. I closed the manila folder and placed my hands flat on the table. I did not feel panic. Panic is an emotion reserved for people who do not understand the rules of the game they are playing. I felt an absolute freezing clarity wash over my entire body. My brother had made a fatal miscalculation. He had mistaken my quiet nature and my willingness to sacrifice for weakness. He actually thought he could outsmart a veteran auditor who had personally dismantled Wall Street executives and sent billionaires to federal prison. I stood up from the cafeteria table and walked slowly back to my car. The throbbing pain in my side was completely gone, replaced by a singular driving purpose. The silent adjustment had officially begun and Kendall had no idea what was coming for him. I drove straight home from the hospital and walked directly into my office. I picked up the telephone and dialed the Central Fraud Division of the National Bank that had underwritten the medical lien. After navigating a maze of automated menus, I finally reached a senior fraud investigator. I identified myself using my social security number and my federal accounting license. I informed the investigator in a perfectly level voice that the $250,000 medical lien attached to my name was a fraudulent instrument. I explained that my signature had been forged, and I formally requested an immediate administrative freeze on the account pending a federal criminal investigation. The investigator typed rapidly on his end. The clicking of his keyboard sounded like a metronome in my quiet office. Then the typing stopped. The investigator cleared his throat, and his tone shifted from professional courtesy to bureaucratic caution. He informed me that the bank could not honor my request to freeze the account. I asked him to explain the legal justification for his refusal. He told me that exactly 4 days after my kidney extraction surgery, a formal document was filed with both the hospital and the underwriting bank. It was a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. I asked him who had submitted the document and who had signed it. The answer hit me like a physical blow, but I did not let out a single breath. The document had been signed by my mother, Martha, and legally notarized by a close friend of my brother. The affidavit explicitly stated that due to severe post-surgical complications in advanced age, I was suffering from acute cognitive decline and delirium. It legally classified me as mentally incapacitated. Under the terms of this fabricated document, my brother Kendall had been granted absolute legal authority over all my financial instruments, my debts, and my medical decisions. The bank considered Kendall the sole authorized administrator of my financial life. My mother had actively participated in stripping away my basic human rights just to protect her favorite son. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with the bank investigator. Arguing with a clerk holding a legally binding document is a waste of oxygen. I simply hung up the phone. I did not have time to process the betrayal because less than 10 minutes later, a heavy commercial truck pulled into my driveway. The loud crunch of tires on gravel was followed by the slamming of heavy car doors. I walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain. Gretchen, my white sister-in-law, was marching up my front walkway. She was wearing a tailored beige trench coat and oversized sunglasses, looking as if she were inspecting a foreclosed property rather than visiting family. Right behind her was a large man carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. I opened the front door before she could even ring the bell. Gretchen stopped on the porch and crossed her arms. She did not offer a greeting. She simply gestured to the man behind her to step forward. The man dropped his bag and pulled out a heavy-duty power drill. I asked Gretchen exactly what she thought she was doing. She smiled a tight, thin smile that did not reach her eyes. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. She held them up but did not hand them to me. She announced in a loud theatrical voice that because of my severe medical debt and my deteriorating mental state, Kendall had formed a family management trust. She stated that as the new legal stewards of my well-being, the trust was taking immediate receivership of my physical assets to offset the massive financial liabilities I had supposedly incurred. In plain English, she was seizing my house. She told me that the locksmith was here to change every deadbolt on the property. She looked me up and down, taking in my loose suit and my pale complexion. She instructed me to go upstairs, pack a single suitcase of basic clothing, and vacate the premises immediately. If I refused, or if I attempted to cause a scene, she promised to call the police. She reminded me with dripping malice that the police would look at the power of attorney claiming I was suffering from dementia, and they would forcibly remove me from my own home for trespassing. She was using my own law-abiding nature and my reputation against me. She expected me to crumble, to beg, or to scream. I looked at the heavy drill in the locksmith's hand, and then I looked directly into Gretchen's eyes. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of protest. A man who fights a battle before he has loaded his weapons is a fool. I simply nodded. I told her I understood the situation and that I would go pack my medication. Her smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of resistance. I turned my back to her and walked down the hallway toward my bedroom. I did not pack clothes. I opened the false bottom of my bedside table and retrieved a pre-packed emergency duffel bag that contained my passport, emergency cash, and a secure laptop. Then I reached into a small velvet box in my dresser drawer. For years, I had investigated corporate espionage and high-level embezzlement. I kept a small inventory of specialized tools. I pulled out a microscopic GPS tracker. It was no larger than a standard shirt button, completely encased in matte black plastic with a battery life of 6 months. I palmed the tiny device and walked back out to the front hallway. The locksmith was already drilling out the brass lock on my front door. The loud grinding noise of the drill filled the air. Gretchen was standing on the porch shouting instructions at the man over the noise. Her expensive leather handbag was resting unguarded on the small console table just inside the entryway. I walked past the table carrying my duffel bag. In one fluid, practiced motion, I brushed my hand against the side of her purse and slipped the tiny tracker deep into the outer lining pocket. The device dropped silently to the bottom. I stepped out onto the front porch and walked past Gretchen. She sneered at me and told me she would send me an email with the address of a cheap motel she had booked for me. I did not look back. I walked to my car, threw the duffel bag into the passenger seat, and started the engine. I drove out of the neighborhood and parked in the lot of a nearby diner. I opened my secure laptop and booted up the tracking software. A small red blinking dot appeared on the screen, perfectly marking Gretchen's exact location. By locking me out of my own house, they thought they had rendered me homeless and helpless. They had actually just untethered a predator. Now I was going to follow the money. I sat in my car in the diner parking lot and watched the glowing screen of my laptop. The small red dot representing the GPS tracker inside Gretchen's designer handbag remained stationary for exactly 12 minutes. Then it began to move. It did not head toward the affluent downtown commercial district. It bypassed the high-end boutiques and the luxury salons she usually frequented on Tuesday afternoons. I put my car in gear and followed. I maintained a safe 2-mile distance, relying entirely on the digital ping of the tracking software. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic while the dull ache in my side served as a constant reminder of the physical price I had already paid. The red dot moved steadily toward the riverfront. This was an industrial area currently undergoing massive and expensive gentrification. I pulled onto a side street overlooking the river and parked my car under the heavy shade of a large oak tree. The tracking signal had stopped moving entirely. I retrieved a pair of compact, high-powered binoculars from my glove compartment. I rolled down my window and surveyed the area through the magnified lenses. I spotted Gretchen's silver luxury SUV immediately. It was parked illegally in a designated commercial loading zone. She was standing at the entrance of a massive multi-acre construction site. Heavy yellow cranes loomed against the gray sky, swinging enormous steel beams over a half-finished concrete foundation. Dust plumed into the air as dump trucks roared past the perimeter fencing. A large billboard proudly announced the future home of the Riverwalk luxury condominiums. Gretchen was standing near the chain-link gate wearing a white hard hat over her perfectly styled hair. She was pointing aggressively at a clipboard held by a stressed-looking construction foreman. She was acting with the absolute authority of a primary owner. My brother was a mediocre real estate investor who flipped cheap suburban properties. He had never managed a commercial project of this massive magnitude. This was a multi-million-dollar development. Kendall and Gretchen simply did not have the liquid capital required to secure the initial zoning permits for a site this size, let alone break ground and pour foundation, unless they had recently acquired a massive untraceable influx of cash. The pieces were beginning to align with terrifying precision. I watched as Gretchen turned and walked into a temporary modular office building set up just inside the main gate. I lowered my binoculars. I needed to know exactly whose name was printed on the legal permit sitting inside that trailer. I opened my emergency duffel bag on the passenger seat and pulled out a high-visibility yellow reflective vest and a plain white hard hat. I always kept basic sight gear in my vehicle from my years conducting physical corporate audits. I put the gear on directly over my charcoal suit. I grabbed a blank clipboard and a heavy metal flashlight. Confidence is the ultimate skeleton key in any secure environment. If you walk with absolute authority, people will naturally step out of your way. I crossed the busy street and walked straight through the main construction gate. A private security guard barely glanced at me as I marched past him with a severe expression on my face. I headed directly for the modular office trailer. I opened the door without knocking and stepped inside. The air conditioning blasted my face. The office was chaotic and loud. It was filled with rolled-up blueprints, empty coffee cups, and the harsh static of two-way radios. Gretchen was nowhere to be seen. She was likely taking a physical tour of the upper concrete decks. A young administrative assistant looked up from her desk. Her eyes widened in surprise at my sudden intrusion. I did not give her a chance to ask questions. I tapped my clipboard aggressively against the doorframe. I announced myself as an independent safety compliance auditor contracted by the Municipal Zoning Board. I told her I was conducting a random spot check on their primary contractor registry and insurance bonding certificates. I demanded to see the main compliance board, immediately citing a fabricated violation code about hazardous material storage on the lower levels. The young woman stammered, clearly intimidated by my sharp tone and my formal attire. She pointed nervously toward a large corkboard mounted on the back wall of the trailer. I walked over to it, my eyes scanning the heavily pinned documents. Every commercial construction site is legally required to post their master contractor registry. This document lists the primary developer, the financial underwriters, and the liability bond holders. I pulled out my mobile phone and quickly snapped high-resolution photographs of every single document pinned to the board. I made absolutely sure to capture the tax identification numbers, the corporate routing codes, and the physical signatures of the managing partners. The assistant watched me nervously from her desk, but she did not dare to intervene. I finished my task in under 60 seconds. I thanked her coldly, told her to expect a formal compliance report in the mail, and walked out of the trailer before the foreman or Gretchen could return from their tour. I walked swiftly back to my parked car. I stripped off the reflective vest, tossed the hard hat into the back seat, and locked the heavy doors. I opened my secure laptop and connected my phone via a data cable. I pulled up the high-resolution images of the contractor registry and zoomed in closely on the primary developer section. The project was not registered under Kendall's name. It was not registered under Gretchen's name either. The primary developer was listed as a limited liability corporation called Apex Holdings. I immediately logged into the state commercial registry database using my professional credentials and ran a deep background search on the corporate tax identification number I had just photographed. Shell companies are specifically designed to hide the true owners behind thick layers of legal paperwork and proxy directors. But a seasoned forensic accountant knows exactly how to peel back those deceptive layers. I bypassed the registered agent and dug straight into the initial incorporation filings. The screen loaded the data. The founding director of Apex Holdings was a man named Thomas. Thomas was Gretchen's older brother. He was a disgraced commercial developer who had filed for massive corporate bankruptcy 3 years ago after a series of highly publicized and disastrous investments. He was legally barred from securing traditional bank loans. He had no money, no credit, and absolutely no professional standing in the financial community. Yet here he was, listed as the sole proprietor of a massive luxury condominium project. I cross-referenced the dates on the incorporation documents. Apex Holdings was officially incorporated exactly 8 days after Kendall launched the medical GoFundMe campaign for my father. The initial seed capital deposited into the Apex corporate account to secure the construction bonds was exactly $400,000. The truth was violently clear. The charity money was never intended for my father. Kendall and Gretchen had weaponized my family's tragedy. They had stolen the public funds meant to save our father's life and illegally funneled every single penny to Gretchen's bankrupt white brother. They used the blood money as the untraceable seed capital to launch a corrupt real estate venture. They were hoping to build a multi-million-dollar empire on the back of my stolen kidney and my father's intense physical suffering. The sheer magnitude of their greed was breathtaking. They had orchestrated a masterclass in financial manipulation and family betrayal, but they had made one fatal error. Commercial real estate is built entirely on leverage, and leverage requires flawless credit to maintain. They had built a massive financial house of cards using stolen funds. Now I knew exactly where all their money was tied up. I closed my laptop. It was time to introduce them to the devastating consequences of their own arrogance. I pulled away from the construction site and drove to the address Gretchen had emailed me. It was a miserable roadside motel on the edge of the city limits with flickering neon lights and a cracked asphalt parking lot. I walked into the cramped room smelling of stale smoke and cheap industrial bleach. I set my emergency duffel bag on the sagging mattress and sat at the small plastic desk to organize my thoughts. I did not have time to dwell on my bleak surroundings because less than an hour later, heavy fists began pounding violently on my cheap wooden door. I stood up and looked through the scratched peephole. Standing outside under the buzzing yellow porch light was my daughter Sasha and her husband Bradley. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Sasha pushed past me into the room. She is a highly respected pediatrician who deals with life and death every single day, but right now she looked absolutely terrified. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Bradley followed closely behind her, locking the door behind him. He is a senior software engineer. He is usually a man of quiet logic and gentle patience, but tonight his face was pale, and his jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his neck were trembling. I asked them what happened. Sasha covered her face with her hands and collapsed onto the edge of the motel bed. Her voice shook as she explained the disaster. Earlier that afternoon, she had logged into the family financial portal to pay the first major tuition installment for my granddaughter's upcoming college semester. The money was supposed to be drawn from a specialized educational trust fund. I had personally seeded that fund a decade ago with a massive initial deposit. A few years later, Kendall had convinced the entire family to let him take over the administrative management of the portfolio. He promised to use his supposed real estate expertise to yield aggressive market returns for his niece's future. Sasha trusted her uncle. I trusted my brother to do the right thing for a child. We were both wrong. Sasha looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. She told me the balance of the college fund was zero. Every single penny of the $85,000 was completely gone. The account had been drained through a series of complex wire transfers authorized by Kendall exactly 3 weeks ago. He had stolen his own niece's future to help fund his fraudulent luxury condominium project. Bradley stepped directly into my personal space. He is a tall, broad-shouldered white man who had always treated me with deep respect, but tonight that respect was entirely burned away by his protective fury. He pointed a finger at my chest. He did not yell, but his voice was thick with venom. He told me this was my fault. He said my entire family knew Kendall was a greedy, manipulative parasite, but I was the only one who consistently enabled him. Bradley accused me of being weak. He said I always played the role of the silent martyr, swallowing my pride to keep a fake peace in a family that actively despised me. He listed my failures with brutal precision. He pointed out that I let my mother treat me like garbage. I let my brother steal the spotlight for a surgery that carved an organ out of my own body. I let my sister-in-law kick me out of a house I paid for, and because of my pathetic, endless tolerance, my granddaughter was now going to lose her seat at a prestigious university. I stood perfectly still in the center of the dingy motel room. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not offer a single excuse. Everything Bradley said was entirely accurate from the perspective of an outsider looking at a broken man. I let him vent his rage. I let him insult my character and question my manhood. I watched the anger burn in his eyes, and I recognized its immense value. A polite son-in-law is useless in a war, but a brilliant software engineer fueled by righteous fury and a desperate need to protect his daughter is the most dangerous weapon a forensic accountant could ever ask for. I needed Bradley to be angry. I needed him to hate Kendall enough to cross legal boundaries when the time came. I absorbed his harsh words like a sponge soaking up water. When he finally ran out of breath, he stepped back, breathing heavily, waiting for me to argue or apologize. I looked at Sasha weeping on the bed, and then I looked directly into Bradley's eyes. I spoke in a voice so cold and quiet that the room instantly fell silent. I told him he was absolutely right about my past behavior. I admitted I had allowed the illusion of family to blind me to the reality of my brother's nature. Then I told him to listen to me very carefully. I promised him that my granddaughter would not miss a single day of college. I swore on my own life that I would return the stolen $85,000, and I promised that I would return it tenfold within exactly 14 days. Bradley blinked in confusion. The absolute certainty in my voice derailed his anger. He looked around the pathetic motel room and then back at me, clearly thinking the trauma of the surgery and the eviction had finally broken my mind. He asked me how a homeless man with a frozen bank account and a massive fraudulent medical lien could possibly recover that kind of money. I did not explain my methods. I simply told him to take his wife home, to lock their doors, and to wait for my instructions. I told him that the era of my silent suffering was permanently over. I ordered them to leave. They walked out of the room, quietly subdued by my sudden shift in demeanor. The moment the door clicked shut, I engaged the deadbolt and pulled the thin curtains tight. I sat back down at the plastic desk and opened my secure laptop. My brother and his wife believed they had stripped me of all my resources. They assumed my wealth was tied entirely to my frozen checking accounts and the house they had just stolen. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. During my 40 years as an international corporate auditor, I had uncovered massive financial loopholes. I never broke the law, but I learned exactly how to maximize it. I routed my internet connection through 3 separate encrypted servers. I logged into a private offshore wealth management portal based in the Cayman Islands. This was a shadow portfolio I had spent 4 decades building, entirely independent of the American banking system and completely invisible to anyone in my family. It was my ultimate contingency plan. The screen loaded, displaying a glowing green number, $1,200,000. It was sitting in high-yield municipal bonds and secure index funds. Kendall was building a multi-million-dollar condominium project using stolen charity money and a bankrupt proxy developer. Commercial real estate ventures of that size are never built with cash. They are built on massive high-interest short-term loans called mezzanine debt. If the developer misses a single payment, the creditor has the absolute legal right to seize the entire property and wipe out the equity. Kendall thought he was a real estate mogul. He was actually a mouse dancing on a trap. To crush him, I did not need to hire a lawyer to argue in front of a judge for years. I needed liquid capital. I needed to become his worst nightmare. I moved my cursor over the primary portfolio dashboard. I selected every single bond and every single fund. I clicked the execution button and initiated a total liquidation of my entire life savings. The automated prompt warned me of the massive penalty fees for an immediate cash withdrawal. I approved the penalties without a second thought. By tomorrow morning, I would have over $1 million of untraceable liquid cash sitting in a blind corporate trust. I was going to find out exactly who owned the debt on my brother's luxury project. And then I was going to buy it. The notification of the emergency family meeting arrived via a sterile text message from Gretchen the following morning. I was sitting at the wobbly plastic desk in my motel room, watching the confirmation of my offshore wire transfer clear into my newly established corporate trust. The message simply dictated that my presence was required at the main family estate at exactly noon. The family estate was a sprawling historic property my father had purchased nearly 50 years ago. It was a beautiful piece of land with towering oak trees and a massive wraparound porch worth at least $2 million on the current market. I put on my gray suit and drove across town, ignoring the persistent dull ache radiating from my surgical scar. When I arrived, I walked through the heavy front doors and into the grand living room. I found my mother Martha pacing nervously across the antique Persian rug. Kendall was standing by the large stone fireplace wearing a somber, dark suit and an expression of deep concern that looked entirely rehearsed. Gretchen sat on the velvet sofa, scrolling through her mobile phone with blatant disinterest in the emotional atmosphere of the room. My father Ellis was seated in his medical recliner in the far corner. He looked exhausted and fragile, but his eyes were sharp and focused on me the moment I entered. Kendall cleared his throat loudly, demanding the attention of the room. He did not offer me a greeting or ask about my recovery. He immediately launched into a theatrical and highly alarming speech about the severe deterioration of our father's health. He claimed he had spoken privately with the surgical team and the senior post-operative care nurses earlier that morning. According to Kendall, the kidney transplant was showing early signs of severe rejection. He lied with absolute unblinking conviction, stating that my father now required round-the-clock intensive monitoring and specialized medical equipment that our family could simply not provide in a residential setting. He painted a terrifying, vividly bleak picture of sudden organ failure and catastrophic medical emergencies happening in the middle of the night. My mother gasped and began to cry softly, pressing a lace tissue to her face. Kendall stepped forward, playing the role of the devoted son, and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. He announced that he had already made the difficult executive decision to transfer our father to a specialized full-time care facility by the end of the week. I knew exactly which facility he was talking about because I saw the glossy brochure resting face up on the coffee table. It was a notoriously underfunded state-run nursing home located on the heavy industrial outskirts of the city. It was a bleak concrete facility where forgotten elderly patients were heavily medicated, ignored by underpaid staff, and left to wither away in cramped shared rooms. It was an absolute death sentence for an 89-year-old man in fragile recovery. Kendall was deliberately trying to physically remove my father from the board so he could liquidate the final remaining family assets without any direct interference. My mother clutched Kendall's hand tightly. Her voice shook as she asked how they could possibly afford even a state-run facility since all the charity money had supposedly been completely exhausted by the initial hospital fees. This was the exact opening Kendall had meticulously engineered from the very beginning. He sighed heavily, portraying the heavy burden of leadership, and pulled a thick manila envelope from his leather designer briefcase. He explained in a soft, persuasive tone that desperate times required terrible and painful sacrifices. He told my mother that the historic family estate was simply too large, too old, and far too expensive to maintain any longer. He claimed the property taxes and the utility bills were a massive financial drain that was preventing them from affording proper medical care. Kendall reached into the envelope and pulled out a drafted real estate contract, laying it flat on the mahogany coffee table. He announced that through his professional real estate network, he had miraculously found an anonymous private investor willing to purchase the entire estate in a pure cash transaction. He framed this discovery as an act of divine intervention meant to save our family. But there was a catch. Because the sale had to be expedited to immediately secure my father's permanent bed at the nursing facility, the investor was only offering $500,000. It was a predatory, insulting lowball offer that completely stripped away nearly $2 million of generational equity. It was absolute highway robbery conducted in broad daylight. Kendall unhooked a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and pushed it directly into my mother's trembling hand. He gently reminded her of the fabricated medical and financial power of attorney she had signed the previous week, granting him total administrative control over the family assets. He told her that while he technically had the absolute legal right to execute the sale himself without her permission, he wanted her physical signature on the paperwork to ensure the family remained spiritually united during this terrible crisis. He leaned down and whispered intensely in her ear. He told her that if she did not sign the contract right now, the investor would walk away and my father would die in this house without the proper medical care he desperately needed. He explicitly weaponized her deep love and her profound fear, turning her emotions into tools of financial extortion. My mother looked down at the complex legal contract through tear-filled eyes. She looked across the room at my father sitting silently in his chair. Then, without reading a single legal clause, without hiring an independent appraiser, or questioning the massive financial loss, she pressed the pen to the heavy paper and signed her name on the primary authorization line. Gretchen finally looked up from her phone and smiled a sharp, vicious smile. The trap had been perfectly sprung and the family legacy was officially signed away. Kendall picked up the signed contract and carefully blew on the wet ink to dry it. He stood up straight and looked directly at me, anticipating a massive explosion. He expected me to shout to demand an immediate legal injunction and to fight for my childhood home. He wanted me to lunge at him so he could call the police and have me permanently barred from the property for being a violent threat to his authority. Gretchen sat up slightly, adjusting her posture to comfortably watch the show. They both thrived on the chaotic emotional damage they inflicted on others. I looked at the signed document resting safely in Kendall's hand. I looked at my weeping mother who believed she had just saved her husband's life. I looked at my father who simply offered me a fraction of a nod. I adjusted my suit jacket and offered Kendall a slow, deliberate nod in return. I told him that his plan was incredibly practical. I stated in a flat, purely analytical tone that liquidating the physical estate to secure immediate medical capital was the only logical maneuver left on the board. I formally commended him for his swift and decisive action. The silence that fell over the grand living room was absolute and suffocating. My mother stopped crying instantly and stared at me in pure, unadulterated horror, viewing my verbal compliance as the ultimate cold-blooded betrayal of my father. Gretchen frowned deeply, her anticipated morning entertainment entirely ruined by my lack of outrage. Kendall blinked, his smooth, confident facade cracking for a fraction of a second in pure confusion. He did not know how to process my total and immediate surrender. I did not give them time to question my motives or press me for an emotional reaction. I checked my wristwatch, stated calmly that I had a pressing appointment downtown, and walked out the front door without another word. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. A cold, genuine smile finally touched my lips. When Kendall had placed the contract on the coffee table, I did not need to read the fine print or the dense legal jargon. I only needed to read the bolded name of the purchasing entity listed at the very top of the page. It was a newly registered limited liability company. I had already run that specific corporate tax identification number during my deep, comprehensive dive into his fraudulent finances the night before. The anonymous cash investor did not exist. The company purchasing the $2 million family estate for pennies was a shell corporation entirely owned and operated by Kendall himself. He was using a portion of the stolen charity funds to legally buy his own parents' house out from under them at a massive, devastating discount. His ultimate plan was to immediately flip the historic property on the open market next month and use the multi-million-dollar profit to save his failing luxury condominium project. He thought he had just executed the perfect invisible financial crime. He believed he was the smartest man in the room. He did not realize that by putting his fraudulent real estate acquisition in writing and presenting it across state lines, he had just handed a veteran forensic accountant the exact federal wire fraud evidence required to absolutely destroy him. I left the family estate with the details of Kendall's fraudulent real estate contract permanently burned into my memory. I drove directly away from the sprawling suburbs and headed deep into the heart of the downtown financial district. I parked in an underground garage and took a private elevator to the top floor of a high-rise glass tower. Waiting for me in a dark mahogany corner office was Abram. Abram was 72 years old and a veteran corporate litigator who wore a custom-tailored three-piece suit like a suit of armor. He was a ruthless legal predator who had spent his entire career orchestrating hostile corporate takeovers and defending absolute financial monsters. He was also my oldest friend. We sat across from each other at his massive oak desk while I laid out the entire paper trail. I showed him the forged medical lien, the fabricated power of attorney, the GoFundMe withdrawal logs, and the state registry documents proving Kendall was using a shell corporation to buy our parents' house for pennies. Abram did not interrupt me. He poured 2 glasses of expensive bourbon, handed one to me, and reviewed the documents with a terrifying surgical precision. When he finished reading, he leaned back in his leather chair and smiled a cold, dangerous smile. He told me the evidence was absolute perfection. He suggested we immediately walk the entire folder over to the regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Abram promised me the federal agents would arrest Kendall for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse before the end of the week. I took a slow sip of my bourbon and shook my head. I told Abram that involving the federal government was out of the question. A federal investigation would automatically trigger a massive asset freeze. The government would lock down the luxury condominium project, placing it into infinite legal receivership. My granddaughter's stolen college tuition would disappear into a bureaucratic black hole for 5 years while the courts ground on. Meanwhile, Kendall would simply hire a decent defense attorney, post a cash bail using his hidden reserves, and live comfortably in his mansion while the legal system stalled. I did not want to send my brother to a white-collar resort prison in 5 years. I wanted immediate, absolute financial execution. I told Abram about the $1.2 million I had just liquidated from my offshore portfolio. I instructed him to quietly establish a blind holding corporation by tomorrow morning. I explained my plan to legally purchase the massive mezzanine debt attached to Kendall's construction project. Abram let out a low whistle of genuine admiration, realizing I was bypassing the justice system entirely to orchestrate a hostile takeover of my brother's entire life. But Abram warned me that to successfully buy the debt without alerting the primary lenders, we needed the exact contractual terms of the master loan agreement. We needed the original paperwork, which was not listed on any public registry. I told Abram I knew exactly where the master file was located, and I already had an operative in mind to retrieve it. Later that evening, I sat in the corner booth of a quiet 24-hour diner on the edge of the city. I ordered a black coffee and waited. Precisely at 10 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed and Bradley walked in. My son-in-law looked exhausted. The righteous fury that had fueled his outburst at my motel the night before had been completely replaced by a heavy, anxious dread. He slid into the vinyl booth across from me and nervously folded his hands on the table. He asked me why I had summoned him in the middle of the night. I did not offer small talk. I simply slid a thick manila folder across the table. I instructed him to open it. Bradley opened the cover and began to read. I watched his eyes scan the bank routing numbers, the GoFundMe withdrawal timestamps, the shell company registrations matching Gretchen's bankrupt brother, and the brutal transfer logs documenting the exact moment Kendall drained the $85,000 college fund. The color completely drained from Bradley's face. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He realized that the quiet, compliant old man he had berated in a cheap motel room had actually been conducting a masterclass-level forensic investigation while physically bleeding from a surgical wound. Bradley closed the folder and pushed it back toward me. His hands were shaking. He looked down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. He apologized. His voice cracked as he begged for my forgiveness, admitting he had been an absolute fool to question my loyalty to my family. He told me he was deeply ashamed of the horrible things he had called me. I reached across the table and placed my hand firmly over his. I told him to stop talking. I explained that guilt is a useless emotion in a war and apologies do not recover stolen money. I told him I needed the fierce, protective anger he had displayed the night before because I had a highly dangerous job for him. Bradley immediately sat up straight. He looked me dead in the eye and swore he would do absolutely anything to protect his daughter and help me destroy Kendall. I nodded and leaned in close. I told him that Kendall was hosting a lavish dinner party at his mansion this coming Saturday. The party was designed to celebrate the fraudulent acquisition of my parents' historic estate. Kendall had explicitly uninvited me, but he had eagerly invited Bradley and Sasha to keep up the illusion of a happy, thriving family. Kendall was deeply arrogant, but his arrogance contained a massive exploitable blind spot regarding race and class. He viewed Bradley as a safe, compliant white professional who was easily impressed by expensive scotch and flashy real estate talk. Kendall would never in a million years suspect Bradley of corporate espionage. I laid out the mission parameters. I told Bradley that the master loan agreement we desperately needed was locked inside a state-of-the-art digital safe located in Kendall's home office on the second floor. The safe was hardwired directly into the mansion's localized smart home network. As a senior software engineer, Bradley possessed the exact technical skill set required to compromise that network. I reached into my coat pocket and produced a small black USB drive. I set it on the table between us. I instructed Bradley to attend the dinner party and play the role of the admiring son-in-law. He needed to flatter Kendall, inflate his massive ego, and keep him occupied in the main living room. At some point during the evening, Bradley had to slip away, locate the primary internet router, and plug the flash drive into the open port. The drive contained a malicious script designed to instantly bypass the router firewall and open a silent backdoor access point. While Bradley kept Kendall drinking and talking, I would be sitting in an unmarked van parked half a block away, tapped directly into the hijacked Wi-Fi signal. I would use the back door to remotely crack the digital safe and download the master financial documents. It was a flawless plan, but it carried extreme risk. If the internet connection dropped, if Kendall noticed the drive, or if anyone walked into the study while the safe was actively engaged, the system would trigger a silent alarm. The police would arrive within 3 minutes, and I would be arrested for felony cyber intrusion. Bradley stared at the small black flash drive resting on the diner table. He did not hesitate. He picked up the drive, slipped it securely into his jacket pocket, and nodded. The inside man was officially recruited and the heist was set in motion. Saturday evening arrived with a bitter, unforgiving chill. I sat in the uninsulated cargo bay of an unmarked gray utility van parked precisely half a block away from my brother's sprawling suburban mansion. The interior of the van was pitch black, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of my secure laptop screen reflecting off my face. I wore a discreet wireless earpiece tuned directly to a highly sensitive microphone taped to the inside of Bradley's suit jacket. Through the encrypted audio feed, I could hear the sharp clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the low, elegant hum of a live string quartet playing in the background. Sasha and Bradley had arrived 15 minutes earlier. Kendall was already holding court in the center of the room. His voice boomed through my earpiece, thick with unearned confidence and premium aged scotch. He was actively gloating to Bradley about his brilliant new real estate acquisitions, completely unaware that he was bragging about stealing our parents' historic home to the exact man tasked with destroying him. I listened coldly as Kendall lectured Bradley on the harsh realities of generational wealth and the necessary ruthless sacrifices of high-level business. He sounded like a man who believed he had permanently conquered the world. He was so utterly distracted by the sound of his own voice and the admiration of his wealthy guests that he completely ignored his physical surroundings. I checked my heavy steel wristwatch. It was exactly time to initiate the breach. I tapped the microphone button on my laptop keyboard and gave Bradley a single short command to execute his maneuver. Inside the crowded mansion, I heard Bradley clear his throat. He praised Kendall's business acumen, playing the role of the eager, subservient son-in-law flawlessly. He asked Kendall to show him the specific architectural renderings for the new condominium project. Kendall eagerly agreed, his massive ego unable to resist an audience. I heard their footsteps move away from the noisy dining room and head toward the massive custom-built mahogany entertainment center in the main living room. This was the exact physical location of the primary smart home router hub. I heard Kendall set his heavy crystal glass down on the marble counter. Bradley needed a momentary distraction to cover his movements. He accidentally knocked his own glass against the sharp edge of the bar, shattering it violently onto the polished hardwood floor. Kendall cursed loudly and yelled for the hired catering staff to bring a broom immediately. In the resulting chaos of apologies and sweeping glass, Bradley dropped to one knee. He reached blindly behind the heavy wooden cabinet. My laptop screen flashed a rapid sequence of gray command lines. Bradley had successfully plugged the black flash drive directly into the open security port of the router. A bright green icon locked onto the center of my screen. I was securely in. I immediately severed the audio link to Bradley's microphone to dedicate my absolute full concentration to the network intrusion. Kendall's mansion was entirely hardwired into a centralized smart home system controlling everything from the ambient lighting to the security cameras and the private local server located in his second-floor study. Kendall had spent tens of thousands of dollars on the physical hardware, but he possessed the typical fatal arrogance of a wealthy amateur. He assumed physical walls and expensive gates equaled digital security. He had never bothered to change the factory default administrator passwords on his internal network nodes. It took me exactly 4 seconds to bypass the primary firewall and gain absolute root access to his private server. I routed my connection through the smart thermostat network to completely mask my digital footprint. I locked onto the secure digital vault partition on his main hard drive. This was where he kept the master financial documents, the original loan agreements, and the unredacted ledgers for all his shell corporations. The digital vault required a secondary biometric passcode. I did not have his fingerprint, but a veteran forensic accountant does not need an invitation to enter a locked room. I had spent years analyzing the vulnerability of dual authentication systems during corporate audits. I simply bypassed the user interface entirely and attacked the backup recovery protocol using a highly aggressive brute force script I had compiled earlier that afternoon. Lines of code cascaded down my screen like falling rain. The encrypted lock held firm for 2 agonizing minutes. Then the encryption shattered completely. The vault swung open digitally, exposing hundreds of highly sensitive corporate files. I initiated a direct peer-to-peer download, transferring the entire directory to my secure laptop. A progress bar appeared on my screen. The files were massive, containing thousands of pages of architectural blueprints, banking statements, and legal contracts. The estimated time to completion was 4 long minutes. I sat in the freezing van and watched the blue bar crawl slowly across the screen. 10%, 30%, 50%. The silence in the van was deafening, broken only by the rapid spinning of my laptop cooling fan. At exactly 80% completion, the audio feed from Bradley's microphone suddenly crackled back to life in my earpiece. The background noise of the party downstairs had vanished. Bradley was breathing heavily, whispering frantically into his lapel. He told me that Gretchen had just left the dining room. She had loudly announced to the guests that she was going upstairs to the study to retrieve a box of Kendall's imported Cuban cigars. The primary local server and the router hub were physically located on the large desk right in the center of that study. If she looked at the server tower, she would see the indicator lights flashing wildly, signaling a massive unauthorized data transfer in progress. My download progress hit 90%. I heard Gretchen's heavy footsteps ascending the wooden staircase. Bradley could not physically stop her without causing a massive, highly suspicious scene. He was trapped on the first floor. I stared intently at the progress bar. 95%. I heard the sharp, distinct click of Gretchen's high heels walking down the second-floor hallway. She was rapidly approaching the study door. 97%. I hovered my finger directly over the emergency kill switch on my keyboard. If I terminated the connection now, the encrypted files would be permanently corrupted and the entire mission would fail instantly. I held my breath. My eyes locked on the screen. 99%. I heard the brass doorknob of the study turn. The heavy wooden door creaked open. 100%. Complete. I slammed my finger onto the kill switch, instantly severing the connection, wiping the backdoor access log, and retracting the malicious script from the router downstairs in a fraction of a second. I slumped back against the cold metal wall of the van, exhaling a long, tight breath. I had the files. I immediately opened the newly downloaded folder and ran a rapid keyword search for the primary commercial loan agreement tied to the luxury condominium project. I opened the master contract and scrolled past the standard liability clauses, zeroing in directly on the amortization schedule. Kendall and his bankrupt brother-in-law had secured a massive mezzanine loan to fund the initial construction phase. I looked at the principal amount, $1 million. But the true fatal flaw was buried deeply in the fine print on page 42. It was a predatory short-term balloon loan with a strict non-compliance acceleration clause. The entire $1 million principal plus 20% compounded interest was not due in a year. It was due next Friday. If Kendall missed that single payment, the creditor had the absolute legal right to instantly seize the entire development project and wipe out all existing equity. Kendall was sitting on a ticking financial time bomb with less than a week left on the clock. I closed my laptop in the dark van. I did not just have his dirty secrets. I had his exact execution date, and I had the cash to buy the guillotine. Monday morning arrived with a heavy downpour that washed the city streets clean. I did not sleep for a single minute after the successful data extraction from my brother's home network. I spent the remaining dark hours of the night sitting at the flimsy plastic desk in my motel room, cross-referencing the downloaded master files against my own forensic accounting matrices. At exactly 8 in the morning, I walked into Abrams' high-rise legal office in the downtown financial district. I did not bring a digital device. I brought a physically printed, heavily indexed binder containing Kendall's most devastating financial secrets. I dropped the heavy binder directly onto Abrams' polished mahogany desk. I instructed him to open it to page 42 of the primary commercial contract. Abram adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the highlighted text. I watched his eyes widen as he absorbed the full legal weight of the non-compliance acceleration clause. He let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed in the quiet office. He told me that Kendall had effectively signed a financial suicide note by agreeing to such aggressive predatory lending terms. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk and outlined our immediate strategy. The offshore wire transfer containing my liquidated $1.2 million had officially cleared into the domestic banking system at dawn. Now we needed an absolute, impenetrable corporate shield to mask my involvement. I instructed Abram to establish a new holding corporation immediately. It had to be registered in the state of Delaware to guarantee total legal anonymity for its executive officers and board members. We named the entity Titan Holdings. Abram mobilized his entire team of junior associates to expedite the process. Within 3/10 hours, they had drafted the ironclad articles of incorporation, secured a reliable registered proxy agent, and established a specialized blind trust to hold the working capital. My name would not appear on a single public registry, state tax filing, or corporate charter. To the outside world, Titan Holdings was just another faceless, heavily funded private equity firm looking for aggressive market acquisitions. In reality, it was a precision-guided missile aimed directly at my brother's fraudulent real estate empire. Once the corporate structure was legally fortified, Abram initiated the capital injection. We moved exactly $1.1 million into the Titan Holdings primary operating account. I told Abram to draft a master assignment of debt agreement. We were not going to sue Kendall in a slow, tedious civil court. We were going to legally purchase the very oxygen his business needed to survive. At 2 in the afternoon, Abram and I arrived at the regional headquarters of the private commercial lending firm that currently held Kendall's mezzanine debt. The firm was run by a ruthless senior underwriter named Mr. Hayes. We sat in a sterile glass-walled boardroom overlooking the gray financial district. Hayes entered the room looking visibly exhausted and highly defensive. Mezzanine lenders operate in a high-risk environment, providing massive amounts of fast cash to developers who cannot secure traditional bank loans. But even a hardened lender like Hayes had his limits, and Kendall's condominium project was rapidly approaching a disastrous threshold. Abram took the lead. He introduced Titan Holdings as an aggressive debt acquisition firm interested in taking over high-yield distressed commercial paper. Abram slid a single sheet of paper across the glass table. It was a formal offer to purchase the entire $1 million master loan agreement tied to the Riverwalk condominium project. Hayes looked at the paper and sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. He admitted that the project had become a massive administrative headache. The primary proxy developer, Gretchen's bankrupt brother, had a terrible industry reputation that was finally catching up with him. The construction was already facing municipal zoning delays, and the financial underwriters at the firm were getting incredibly nervous about the upcoming balloon payment deadline this Friday. Hayes was staring down the barrel of a messy, highly publicized and prolonged foreclosure process that would tie up his firm's liquid capital for years. I spoke for the first time. I looked directly into Hayes' eyes and made him an offer he could not possibly refuse. I told him Titan Holdings would buy the debt for $1,050,000 in pure, immediately available cash. We were offering him a complete return of his initial principal plus a guaranteed $50,000 premium just to walk away clean today. Hayes blinked in sheer disbelief. He was actively bracing for a massive financial loss, and we were handing him a golden parachute out of a crashing airplane. He did not ask questions about our hidden motives. He did not care why a mysterious private equity firm wanted to buy a toxic real estate loan. He only cared about protecting his own quarterly profit margins. Hayes picked up his heavy brass pen and signed the master assignment agreement without a second thought. Within 20 minutes, our domestic wire transfer was fully authorized and cleared by his banking department. The executives shook our hands and left the room, leaving the original contracts on the table. Abram carefully packed the freshly signed, legally binding master loan documents into his leather briefcase. We walked out of the glass tower and stepped onto the busy city sidewalk. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the afternoon air crisp and sharp in my lungs. Abram handed me the heavy briefcase. He patted my shoulder, offered a tight, victorious smile, and walked toward his waiting town car. I stood alone on the street corner, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the leather handle in my grip. The dull physical ache in my left side from the kidney extraction suddenly felt completely irrelevant. The power dynamic of my entire family had just violently shifted in a way none of them could possibly comprehend. For 69 years, I had been the quiet, reliable foundation they constantly walked all over. They had openly mocked my modest lifestyle, belittled my accounting career, and literally carved a vital organ out of my body to save our father, only to hand the entire credit to a manipulative thief. They had locked me out of my own home and stolen my granddaughter's future without a single shred of remorse. Kendall and Gretchen believed they were the absolute masters of the board because they operated without a conscience or a moral compass. But they had forgotten one crucial, unforgiving detail about the real world. A man who truly understands the invisible flow of money understands the ultimate flow of power. I was no longer the discarded, bleeding older brother begging for a seat at the family table. By legally acquiring that master debt agreement, I had instantly become the supreme dictator of their entire financial reality. I owned the concrete foundation of their luxury condominiums. I owned the massive steel beams swinging from their yellow cranes. I owned the very ground they walked on. The massive balloon payment of $1 million was due exactly this coming Friday. If they failed to pay, I had the absolute authority to wipe them out entirely. But I am not a patient man who simply waits for a deadline to pass and hopes for the best. I knew Kendall would desperately scramble to find the cash. He would try to secure an emergency bank extension, liquidate hidden assets, or leverage the stolen charity funds to save his project. I was not going to give him the chance to take a single breath. It was time to systematically cut every single financial lifeline he had left. Tuesday morning broke with a dull gray sky, perfectly matching the cold mechanical precision of my next maneuver. I sat at the small plastic desk in my motel room, sipping a cup of bitter black coffee. I had successfully acquired the massive $1 million mezzanine debt tied to my brother's luxury condominium project. I was officially his supreme creditor. The balloon payment was due this coming Friday. Kendall knew the deadline was approaching. He was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid regarding basic calendar dates. I knew his exact financial strategy. He was planning to consolidate the remaining stolen charity funds, drain the last of my granddaughter's college savings, and wire the entire sum to the original commercial lender by Thursday afternoon to satisfy the debt and keep his construction site operational. He thought he had the liquid capital ready to deploy. It was my job to make absolutely sure his money vanished into thin air before he could even touch it. During my 40 years as a forensic auditor, I learned that the most destructive force in the modern financial system is not a lawsuit. It is the federal government's anti-money laundering compliance protocols. Under the strict guidelines of the Bank Secrecy Act and the Patriot Act, Financial institutions are legally terrified of processing illicit funds. If a bank knowingly facilitates money laundering or wire fraud, the federal government can hit them with fines running into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Because of this massive liability, banks do not take chances. If they receive credible, documented evidence of severe financial crimes, their automated compliance algorithms trigger an immediate, absolute lockdown of the suspect's entire financial portfolio. They do not call the client to ask for an explanation. They do not offer a grace period. They simply freeze everything and lock the doors. I opened my secure laptop and began assembling the dossier. I did not write an angry letter or a passionate plea for justice. I wrote a sterile, highly technical compliance report formatted exactly like an internal federal audit. I attached the forged medical lien highlighting the exact discrepancies in the signature. I attached the time-stamped withdrawal logs from the public fundraising platform. I cross-referenced those withdrawals with the initial seed capital deposited into the shell company registered to Gretchen's bankrupt brother. I proved using flawless mathematical logic and irrefutable digital evidence that Kendall was actively engaged in a complex layering scheme designed to wash stolen charity funds through a commercial real estate venture. I compiled the massive file into a single encrypted document. I bypassed the standard customer service emails and routed the dossier directly to the senior vice president of the Central Fraud Compliance Division at Kendall's Primary National Bank. I hit send. The trap was set. The detonation occurred exactly 4 hours later. I was sitting in my car near the downtown financial district when my secure mobile phone vibrated. It was Bradley. He was breathing heavily, calling me from a locked bathroom stall inside a high-end steakhouse. He had invited Kendall to lunch under the guise of discussing future tech investments. Bradley quickly relayed the beautiful chaos he had just witnessed. When the waiter brought the bill for their expensive lunch, Kendall confidently dropped his heavy metal black card onto the leather tray. 2 minutes later, the waiter returned looking incredibly uncomfortable. He informed Kendall that the card had been declined. Kendall laughed, assuming it was a simple network error. He pulled out a secondary platinum credit card. Declined. He pulled out his corporate debit card linked directly to his real estate holding company. Declined. Bradley watched as Kendall's smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a sudden sharp confusion. Kendall stepped outside the restaurant to call his elite private wealth manager. Bradley followed him closely, listening to the one-sided conversation. Kendall screamed into the phone, demanding to know why his credit lines were malfunctioning. According to Bradley, the color completely drained from Kendall's face as he listened to the banker's response. The wealth manager did not offer apologies or solutions. He read a legally mandated robotic script. He informed Kendall that all of his personal business and trust accounts had been placed under a mandatory administrative freeze pending an active federal review for severe compliance violations. The banker stated that he was legally prohibited from discussing the matter any further and abruptly disconnected the call. Kendall frantically opened the mobile banking application on his phone. Bradley saw the screen over his shoulder. Every single account displayed a massive red padlock icon and an available balance of 0. Kendall was entirely locked out of his own financial existence. He could not transfer funds. He could not pay his contractors. He could not even pay for his expensive steak. He was a multimillionaire on paper, but in reality he was suddenly poorer than a man sleeping on the street. Panic is a fascinating emotion to observe in a man who has never faced true adversity. By Wednesday morning, the reality of the situation had fully crashed down upon my brother. He had exactly 48 hours remaining before the massive $1 million balloon payment was due on his condominium project. If he missed the Friday deadline, the mysterious private equity firm holding his debt would instantly foreclose, wiping out his entire company, ruining Gretchen's family, and leaving him with nothing but millions in secondary liabilities. He was trapped in a rapidly shrinking box. He could not secure a fast, high-interest bridge loan from another bank, because his primary accounts were frozen under federal suspicion. No legitimate financial institution would touch him. He could not access the stolen GoFundMe cash. He could not access my granddaughter's college fund. His primary financial arteries had been violently severed. He became a desperate, cornered animal. And desperate men make incredibly reckless, highly illegal mistakes. He needed liquid cash immediately, or he needed an asset he could leverage with an underground, unlicensed hard money lender to secure the $1 million by Friday. He only had one major physical asset left on the board: our parents' historic family estate. He had already manipulated our mother into signing the fraudulent sales contract transferring the $2 million property to his own shell company for a fraction of its worth. But a signed piece of paper was not enough to secure a fast, illegal loan. The hard money lenders demanded immediate vacant physical possession of the collateral. They would not hand over $1 million if my 89-year-old father was still actively living in the primary bedroom connected to vital medical equipment. Kendall could not wait for the standard 30-day legal eviction process. He did not have the time to negotiate a peaceful transition to the terrible state-run nursing home he had threatened them with earlier. He needed the house completely empty by Thursday night so he could hand the physical keys to the loan sharks on Friday morning. He decided to abandon the illusion of the caring, devoted son entirely. He decided to forcibly remove our father from the property by any means necessary. He thought he was making a bold, decisive, executive move to save his crumbling empire. He did not realize he was stepping directly into the final devastating phase of my trap. I was already waiting for him in the dark. The heavy darkness of Thursday morning blanketed the historic family estate. I sat in my car parked silently under the thick canopy of a massive oak tree directly across the street. The dashboard clock read 2 in the morning. Kendall was completely out of options and running out of time. To secure a massive illegal loan from underground creditors before his Friday deadline, he needed this $2 million property completely vacant by sunrise. I watched the quiet street intently. Exactly 10 minutes later, a rusted white utility van without any commercial markings turned the corner and idled up the driveway. The engine knocked loudly, breaking the silence of the affluent neighborhood. Kendall stepped out of the passenger side. He was not wearing his expensive tailored suits or his arrogant smile. He wore a wrinkled tracksuit and looked incredibly frantic, pacing the asphalt like a trapped animal. He signaled to the back of the van and 2 massive men stepped out. They were wearing cheap, oversized hospital scrubs, but they were clearly not medical professionals. They were hired muscle recruited to forcefully evict my 89-year-old father in the middle of the night. Kendall unlocked the heavy oak front door of the estate and led the men inside. I watched the windows on the second floor illuminate one by one. The silent invasion had begun. Through the sheer curtains, I saw shadows moving rapidly across my parents' master bedroom. A few minutes later, the front door swung open violently. The 2 hired thugs emerged, carrying my father down the porch steps in a cheap collapsible transport wheelchair. My father looked incredibly frail, wrapped tightly in a thin blanket, but his eyes darted around the dark yard in absolute terror. My mother, Martha, trailed closely behind them, clutching her dressing gown and weeping loudly. She was clearly completely disoriented by the sudden midnight intrusion. Kendall was barking harsh, aggressive orders at her. He lied effortlessly, telling her that the transplant team had just called a medical emergency and they needed to transport Ellis to the state hospital immediately or he would die before dawn. He told her there was no time to wait for a real ambulance. The sheer cruelty of his actions was breathtaking. He was actively traumatizing his own mother and risking the life of his fragile father just to clear the real estate collateral for a desperate loan. They wheeled my father toward the open back doors of the rusted van. It was time to intervene. I turned the ignition key and slammed my foot on the accelerator. My car roared to life and shot out from under the oak tree. I drove straight across the street and jammed the front bumper of my vehicle horizontally across the narrow brick driveway. I completely blocked the exit path of the white van. I threw the transmission into park and turned my high-beam headlights on maximum brightness. The blinding white light washed over the driveway, instantly illuminating Kendall and his hired thugs like criminals caught in a spotlight. I stepped out of my car and walked calmly to the center of the driveway. Kendall threw his hands up to shield his eyes from the intense glare. When his vision adjusted and he recognized my face, his entire polished facade completely shattered. He lost his mind. His face turned a deep, violently angry shade of red, and he marched aggressively toward me. He screamed into the cold night air, cursing my name and demanding I move my vehicle immediately. He threatened to have his thugs beat me into the pavement right there in front of our mother. I did not take a single step back. I stood perfectly still with my hands resting loosely at my sides. I informed my brother in a loud, carrying voice that transporting a recent organ transplant patient in an unsterilized, unlicensed cargo van was a severe federal health violation. I told him he was executing an illegal midnight eviction and I was not moving my car an inch. Kendall lunged forward but stopped just short of throwing a punch, realizing that assaulting me would delay his timeline even further. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his mobile phone with trembling hands. He screamed that I was a mentally unstable trespasser violating his legal authority. He dialed the emergency dispatch number, shouting frantically to the operator that a violent intruder was preventing critical medical personnel from saving his dying father. He demanded an immediate armed police response to arrest me. He hung up the phone and smiled a vicious, triumphant smile, thinking he had just outsmarted me again. He truly believed the fabricated power of attorney would force the police to arrest me and clear his path. He did not realize that calling the police was the exact tactical escalation I required to completely stall his illegal eviction and create absolute chaos on my terms. The wail of police sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood less than 4 minutes later. 2 local patrol cruisers aggressively hopped the curb with their red and blue lights flashing violently against the brick facade of the family home. 4 police officers stepped out of their vehicles with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Kendall instantly ran toward them, playing the role of the desperate, victimized son. He waved his fraudulent medical power of attorney in the air and pointed a shaking finger directly at me. He shouted that I was a dangerous lunatic suffering from surgical dementia trying to murder our father by blocking the ambulance. The lead officer frowned, taking the document and shining a heavy flashlight directly into my face. Before the officer could ask me a single question, a loud, piercing wail echoed across the driveway. It was my father. Ellis suddenly began thrashing wildly in the collapsible wheelchair. He grabbed the uniform pants of a second officer standing nearby and began crying out in a high, panicked voice. My father executed a flawless theatrical performance of a man suffering from a severe acute dementia episode. He looked around wildly, acting completely detached from reality. He screamed that he was being kidnapped by strangers and begged the police to save him. He pointed directly at Kendall and called him by the wrong name, shouting that this evil man was trying to steal his organs. The officers were instantly alarmed and deeply confused. The commanding officer immediately ordered Kendall and his sketchy transport crew to step completely away from the patient. Kendall frantically tried to argue, waving the legal papers again, but the police were no longer listening to him. They viewed him as a potential abuser attempting an illegal midnight kidnapping of a vulnerable senior citizen. The lead officer declared that absolutely nobody was moving until a certified municipal ambulance arrived to officially evaluate the elderly man. In the midst of the loud, chaotic argument between Kendall and the police, I stepped quietly toward my father's wheelchair. I leaned down, pretending to adjust the heavy blanket around his shivering shoulders. My father looked up at me. The dementia act dropped from his face for a microscopic fraction of a second. His eyes were razor-sharp and filled with intense clarity. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the fabric of my coat. With a swift, practiced motion, Ellis slid a heavy, cold brass key directly into my coat pocket. It was the master key to the family's original lockbox. The ultimate weapon was finally in my hands. I stepped back from my father's wheelchair as the legitimate municipal paramedics finally arrived. Their flashing red and white lights added to the chaotic illumination of the brick driveway. Kendall was entirely distracted, too busy screaming at the police captain and waving his useless legal documents to notice my departure. I slipped my right hand deep into my heavy coat pocket, my fingers closing tightly around the cold brass key my father had just given me. I knew exactly what this key opened. Years ago, long before my brother's greed had completely poisoned the family dynamic, my father had told me about a hidden lockbox secured beneath the floorboards of his basement workshop. I did not get back into my car. Instead, I walked casually around the side of the sprawling house, letting the thick darkness of the property swallow my movements. I slipped through the unlocked cellar doors while the entire neighborhood remained focused on the screaming match out front. The basement smelled heavily of old sawdust, motor oil, and damp earth. I navigated the dark, cluttered room using only the faint, focused beam of my mobile phone screen. I moved a heavy wooden workbench aside with my shoulder and pulled up a loose, grooved floorboard hidden near the concrete foundation. Beneath it sat a heavy, fireproof steel lockbox covered in a thick layer of gray dust. I inserted the brass key. It turned with a satisfying, heavy mechanical click. I opened the heavy lid. Inside, resting carefully on top of a stack of old military medals and fading family photographs, was a thick manila envelope. I pulled the documents out and shined my light directly on the heavy yellowed parchment. It was the original physical deed to the historic family estate. It was completely intact, featuring the raised municipal seals and my father's original signature pressed into the paper 50 years ago. I rapidly scanned the secondary legal documents attached to the main deed. Kendall had always assumed my parents held the massive property in a standard joint tenancy. He assumed that by manipulating my mother with a fraudulent power of attorney, he could legally force the sale of the entire estate without any resistance. But Kendall was a sloppy amateur who never conducted proper due diligence. The documents resting in my hands revealed a devastating legal truth. Decades ago, my father had restructured the property deed to include a strict unilateral survivorship and consent clause. My mother legally could not sell the house, nor could any agent acting on her behalf without the physical presentation of this specific original deed and my father's verified sound mental consent. The predatory contract Kendall had forced my mother to sign earlier that week was completely worthless. He had leveraged his entire illicit real estate empire on a piece of paper that held absolutely no legal weight. I slipped the heavy envelope inside my jacket, carefully replaced the floorboard, and exited the basement just as the paramedics were loading my father safely into the ambulance. I walked back to my car, drove away from the flashing lights, and headed straight back to the downtown financial district. It was 3 a.m, but Abram was already waiting for me in his high-rise corporate office. He had a pot of black coffee brewing and his elite legal team on standby via a secure conference call. I dropped the original deed directly onto his polished desk. Abram reviewed the yellowed parchment and the strict survivorship clause with absolute professional glee. He immediately fired up his digital dictation machine. We did not have time to wait for the morning civil courts to open. We utilized a specialized, highly expedited filing system reserved exclusively for emergency corporate injunctions and high-wealth asset protection. Abram drafted an airtight, aggressive legal maneuver. Using my father's explicitly documented wishes and the original physical deed, we completely bypassed the fraudulent power of attorney Kendall had fabricated. We executed a rapid unilateral transfer of the entire historic family estate directly into a newly established irrevocable trust, and I was listed as the sole absolute trustee. By placing the property into an irrevocable trust, we permanently removed the massive house from my parents' personal asset pool. It could not be sold, seized, leveraged, or modified by anyone, especially not my brother. The state electronic registry updated at exactly 5 a.m. The transfer was permanent and bulletproof. Kendall's shell company had just attempted to purchase a property that legally no longer belonged to our parents. By signing that fraudulent contract and attempting to use it to secure a massive illegal loan from underground creditors, Kendall had escalated his crimes from simple family manipulation to massive federal real estate fraud. Abram printed the final confirmation receipts and handed them to me across the desk. The heavy paper felt exactly like a loaded weapon in my hands. We had successfully protected the family home and entirely removed my brother's final source of financial leverage. The sun finally rose over the city, casting a cold, bright light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law office. It was officially Friday morning. The absolute deadline for the $1 million mezzanine debt had officially arrived at midnight. Kendall had not made the required payment. The massive financial extension he desperately needed from his underground lenders had evaporated the moment my father's midnight eviction was thwarted by the police. Kendall's luxury condominium project was now officially in massive catastrophic default. Yet my brother remained completely oblivious to his own impending destruction. Through Bradley's continued surveillance of the family group chat, I knew exactly what Kendall and Gretchen were doing this morning. They were not panicking. They were celebrating. They blindly assumed that despite the police intervention at the house, the signed contract from my mother was still legally binding. They believed the hard money loan would eventually clear by the end of the business day, covering their massive debt at the absolute last possible second. They were currently dressing in their most expensive designer clothing, preparing to host a massive catered ribbon-cutting ceremony at the construction site to impress their wealthy investors and the local press. They were setting up champagne towers and rolling out a literal red carpet, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had already collapsed into dust. They did not know their bank accounts were frozen by the federal government. They did not know the family estate was permanently locked in an ironclad trust. And most importantly, they did not know that the mysterious private equity firm holding their defaulted $1 million debt was currently sitting in a black town car driving directly toward their grand opening. I adjusted my tie, picked up the heavy leather briefcase containing their absolute financial ruin, and walked toward the elevator. It was time to attend a party. The Riverwalk condominium site was completely transformed. The dust and mud of the active construction zone had been swept away and covered by thick sections of pristine red carpet. Massive white silk banners hung from the towering yellow cranes, catching the crisp morning wind. A sprawling white catering tent dominated the center of the concrete foundation. Inside the tent, waiters in crisp white shirts circulated among the crowd carrying heavy silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The guest list was a highly curated collection of local politicians, wealthy private investors, and regional business reporters. Kendall had orchestrated a flawless visual illusion of massive financial success. He stood at a temporary wooden podium set up at the edge of the red carpet. He wore a stunning bespoke navy suit, his hair perfectly styled, his teeth gleaming white under the flash of the press cameras. He tapped the microphone, silencing the cheerful chatter of the wealthy crowd. He began his speech with a practiced, humble smile. He spoke passionately about the immense value of hard work and the unyielding power of a strong family foundation. He looked out over the audience and lied with absolute terrifying conviction. He told the investors that this massive luxury project was not just a commercial venture but a deeply personal testament to his aging parents. He claimed he had spent his entire life learning the value of sacrifice from his father. He boldly stated that the foundation of these luxury buildings was poured using the ethics and integrity passed down through generations of our family. He actually possessed the sheer audacity to talk about protecting the vulnerable and honoring family legacy while standing on a concrete slab entirely funded by stolen medical charity money. He smiled warmly at Gretchen, who stood in the front row clapping enthusiastically. He thanked her publicly for her unwavering support during his supposed tireless efforts to secure the initial zoning and construction financing. The local press ate up every single word. The politicians nodded in solemn agreement, entirely blinded by the expensive champagne and the illusion of progress. Kendall raised his glass to toast the bright, lucrative future of his real estate empire. He was entirely in his element, bathing in the unearned admiration of his peers. He truly believed he had won the war. He did not realize his entire kingdom was built on a legal fault line that had already violently ruptured at midnight. The heavy engine of the black Lincoln Town car purred quietly as it pulled directly up to the main VIP entrance of the construction site. The hired driver stepped out immediately and opened the rear door. I stepped out onto the asphalt. The dull, persistent ache in my left side from the kidney extraction was entirely gone, replaced by a surge of pure, freezing adrenaline. I was not wearing the loose, wrinkled clothes of a sick, defeated old man. I was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored Italian wool suit as dark as midnight. My shoes were polished to a mirror shine. I adjusted my silk tie and buttoned my jacket. I looked exactly like the senior corporate executioner I had been for 4 decades. Abram stepped out of the opposite door. He wore a matching 3-piece charcoal suit and mirrored sunglasses. In his right hand, he carried a heavy, reinforced leather briefcase containing the absolute legal destruction of my brother's life. We did not wait for an invitation. We bypassed the velvet ropes and stepped directly onto the plush red carpet. The atmosphere around the entrance shifted instantly. The wealthy investors and the hired catering staff instinctively stepped out of our way. Confidence and absolute authority possess a physical weight, and Abram and I carried it like a loaded weapon. We did not look like guests. We looked like a federal raid dressed in high-end wool. The press photographers near the back of the crowd turned their heavy lenses toward us, sensing a sudden anomaly in the carefully orchestrated event. They did not know my name, but the sheer intensity of our arrival demanded their immediate attention. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the wooden podium at the front of the tent. Kendall was still smiling, shaking hands with a local city councilman. He had not seen me yet. I walked with slow, deliberate, measured steps. Every single footfall on the red carpet brought me closer to the exact center of his fraudulent universe. I was bringing the harsh, unforgiving reality of numbers and legal contracts directly into his fantasy world. Gretchen was the first one to spot us. She was standing near the edge of the catering tent, laughing loudly with a group of wealthy investor wives. She turned to signal a waiter for another glass of champagne, and her eyes landed directly on my face. Her forced, elegant smile instantly collapsed. The crystal flute in her hand trembled slightly, spilling a few drops of expensive wine onto her designer dress. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, vicious rage. She viewed me exactly as she had treated me all week. To her, I was nothing but a broken, senile old man. I was a homeless liability suffering from severe surgical dementia who had somehow escaped my cheap roadside motel to ruin her perfect high society photographs. She slammed her glass down onto a nearby cocktail table and aggressively snapped her fingers at the head of the private security detail standing nearby. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at my chest. She did not wait for the guards. She marched straight toward me, her high heels clicking furiously against the concrete. She intercepted Abram and me just as we reached the outer edge of the main crowd. She crossed her arms and glared at me with absolute disgust. She kept her voice in a harsh, venomous whisper to avoid alerting the press. She demanded to know exactly what I was doing at a private commercial event. She asked me if I had lost my mind or simply forgotten my medication. She aggressively told me that this was a celebration for people who actually built wealth and contributed to society, not a charity kitchen for jealous, pathetic failures. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single word of defense. I looked at her with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing an insect. The burly head of security stepped up right behind her, resting his heavy hand intimidatingly on his duty belt. Gretchen commanded the guard to grab me by my collar and physically drag me off the property before my brother saw me and suffered unnecessary stress. The security guard stepped forward, reaching his thick arm out toward my shoulder to forcefully remove me from the red carpet. Abram slightly shifted his weight, his hand tightening around the handle of the leather briefcase. The trap was fully loaded, the audience was watching, and Gretchen was eagerly pulling the final trigger herself. The burly security guard lunged forward, his thick fingers aimed directly at the lapel of my custom suit. He never made contact. Abram moved with the sudden striking speed of a much younger man. He stepped sharply between us, raising his left hand in a rigid, authoritative halt, while his right hand smoothly extracted his thick leather wallet. He flipped it open directly in the guard's face, exposing his gold-plated State Bar medallion and his senior litigator credentials. Abram did not raise his voice to a scream. He used the booming, resonant tone of a man accustomed to commanding federal courtrooms. He informed the guard that if he laid a single finger on either of us, he would personally ensure the man faced aggravated assault charges and a devastating civil lawsuit that would bankrupt his entire bloodline. The guard froze instantly. He looked at the credentials, looked at Abram's unblinking stare, and slowly lowered his hands, stepping back into the crowd. Gretchen was hyperventilating with pure rage. She shrieked at the guard, calling him useless, and demanded he do his job. Abram ignored her tantrum. He set his heavy leather briefcase onto the nearest cocktail table, pushing aside a tray of expensive champagne glasses. The crystal shattered on the concrete, drawing the immediate attention of every single guest in the tent. Abram unclasped the brass locks with a sharp snap. He reached inside and extracted a thick, heavily bound stack of legal documents. He turned to Gretchen, who was now staring at the open briefcase in confusion. Abram did not hand her the papers politely. He slammed the entire stack directly against her chest, forcing her to grab them by pure reflex. He told her she had officially been served. Gretchen looked down at the bold red text stamped across the top page. It was a formal notice of absolute default and immediate asset seizure. The loud shattering of the champagne glasses completely derailed Kendall's arrogant speech. He stopped mid-sentence, staring from the wooden podium into the crowd. When he saw me standing on his red carpet, his fake, humble smile instantly vanished. He jumped down from the stage and shoved his way through the whispering crowd of politicians and investors. He marched up to us, his face flushed with anger. He looked at the legal documents clutched in his wife's trembling hands, and then glared directly at me. He demanded to know what kind of sick, pathetic joke I was playing. He shouted that I was trespassing on a multi-million-dollar commercial site and threatened to have me arrested. Abram stepped forward, entirely unfazed by Kendall's aggressive posturing. Abram projected his voice so loudly that it echoed off the massive white canopy of the tent, ensuring that every single reporter, politician, and private investor heard his next words with absolute clarity. Abram formally introduced me to the crowd. He did not introduce me as Kendall's older brother or as a retired accountant. He introduced me as the chief executive officer and sole primary shareholder of Titan Holdings. Kendall scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes. He asked what a fictional holding company had to do with his construction site. Abram smiled his cold, predatory smile. He announced that Titan Holdings was the aggressive private equity firm that had legally purchased the $1 million mezzanine debt underwriting this entire condominium project. The murmurs in the crowd instantly died. The silence that fell over the massive tent was heavy and suffocating. The wealthy investors exchanged panicked glances. Kendall froze, his eyes darting between Abram and me. Abram continued, his voice echoing like a judge reading a final verdict. He stated that the absolute deadline for the balloon payment had expired precisely at midnight. Because the payment was not received, the primary loan was now in catastrophic default. Under the strict terms of the non-compliance acceleration clause, Titan Holdings was exercising its legal right to initiate an immediate hostile takeover of the entire commercial property. Abram pointed a finger directly at Kendall's chest. He declared that Kendall no longer owned the concrete foundation, the steel beams, or the permits. Everything on this site now legally belonged to me. I watched the profound, devastating realization wash over my brother's face. The massive real estate empire he thought he had built, using stolen charity money, had just been legally vaporized in front of his most important peers. Kendall stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. Then a sharp, nervous laugh erupted from his throat. It was a pathetic, high-pitched sound, completely devoid of his usual arrogance. He turned to the crowd of panicked investors and raised his hands, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of control. He shouted that this was nothing but a massive clerical error. He claimed I was a bitter, estranged family member trying to stage a dramatic stunt to ruin his grand opening. He looked back at Abram and confidently declared that the legal notices were completely fraudulent. Kendall proudly announced to the entire tent that he had personally negotiated a verbal extension with Mr. Hayes, the senior underwriter at the original commercial lending firm. He claimed the bank had given him until the end of the business day to wire the funds, completely unaware that his accounts were already frozen by the federal government. Kendall pulled his expensive mobile phone from his suit pocket. He told the investors he would call the bank right now, put Mr. Hayes on speakerphone, and expose my pathetic lies to the press. His hands were shaking violently as he scrolled through his contacts and tapped the specific direct line for the mezzanine lending department. He held the phone up high for everyone to see, the speakerphone icon glowing brightly on the screen. The crowd leaned in, waiting in absolute silence for the bank to answer. The digital dialing tone echoed loudly through the tent. 1 ring, 2 rings. But the ringing did not just come from the speaker of Kendall's phone. A second perfectly synchronized ringing tone began to emit from my immediate physical location. Everyone turned to look at me. I reached into the breast pocket of my custom Italian suit. I pulled out a sleek black secondary mobile phone. It was the dedicated administrative device linked directly to the Titan Holdings corporate accounts, which Abram had set up to intercept all communications regarding the newly acquired debt. The screen of my black phone was flashing brightly, displaying Kendall's exact cell phone number as the incoming caller. I looked directly into my brother's terrified eyes. I pressed the green accept button on my screen and held the phone up to my mouth. I spoke into the receiver, and my voice echoed simultaneously out of the speakerphone in Kendall's trembling hand. I told him Mr. Hayes no longer works on this account. I told him he was speaking to the bank. I kept the black phone pressed to my ear while my voice resonated through the speaker of Kendall's expensive mobile device. The entire tent of wealthy investors and hungry journalists fell into an absolute, breathless silence. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I tapped the screen of my secondary phone and initiated a pre-recorded sequence. I had instructed Abram to legally port the bank's automated debt transfer confirmation system directly to my device. A crisp, mechanical female voice echoed simultaneously out of both our phones. The automated system explicitly stated that the commercial mezzanine loan held under Kendall's Shell Corporation had been permanently transferred. It confirmed that the $1 million principal plus all associated penalty fees was severely delinquent and immediately payable to Titan Holdings. The automated message concluded with a harsh final beep, and the call disconnected. The sheer impossibility of the situation struck Kendall with the force of a physical blow. He stood frozen on the red carpet, staring down at his phone as if it had just turned into a venomous snake. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. The smooth, arrogant real estate mogul who had been giving a passionate speech about family values just 2 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified, exposed fraud who suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of a massive cliff. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. He could not argue with the automated federal banking system. He could not charm his way out of a legally binding commercial contract executed in broad daylight. Abram stepped forward and tapped the heavy stack of foreclosure documents Gretchen was still clutching against her chest. He casually advised Kendall to read page 42, detailing the exact non-compliance acceleration clause he had foolishly signed. I watched the profound, crushing weight of absolute ruin settle onto Kendall's shoulders. The realization that his quiet, compliant older brother had meticulously orchestrated a flawless financial execution was completely destroying his mind. He had spent his entire adult life underestimating me, stealing from our family, and believing his own lies. Now the undeniable truth was broadcasting loud and clear across his entire fraudulent empire. Gretchen shattered the heavy silence. She dropped the thick stack of legal documents onto the concrete floor and let out a high, piercing shriek. She lunged toward her husband, grabbing the lapels of his custom navy suit. She screamed at him, her voice cracking with pure panic and venom, demanding to know what he had done with her brother's construction company. She violently shook him, asking where the money was and why a senile old man suddenly owned their entire multi-million-dollar project. Kendall could not answer her. He stumbled backward, trying to peel her manicured hands off his jacket. The wealthy private investors standing in the front row did not need to wait for an explanation. They were seasoned financial predators who instantly recognized the stench of a catastrophic bankruptcy. They began whispering frantically to each other, aggressively dialing their own lawyers and financial advisors. A wave of absolute panic rippled through the massive white tent. The politicians who had been smiling and clapping minutes ago immediately turned their backs and rushed toward the VIP exit, desperate to distance themselves from a massive public scandal. The local business reporters and press photographers did not run away. They realized they were witnessing the explosive real-time destruction of a prominent real estate developer. The heavy clicking of camera shutters filled the air like rapid gunfire. Brilliant white flashes illuminated Kendall and Gretchen as they continued their vicious, highly public screaming match on the red carpet. They captured every single moment of their absolute humiliation. They photographed the shattered champagne glasses, the dropped foreclosure notices, and the terrified expressions of the fleeing investors. The grand opening of the Riverwalk condominiums had officially transformed into a spectacular, undeniable financial funeral. I stood perfectly still amidst the absolute chaos, watching the empire built on my stolen kidney and my father's suffering burn entirely to the ground. The blinding flashes of the press cameras finally pushed Kendall completely over the edge. The desperate, cornered animal inside him violently took over. He violently shoved Gretchen away from him, causing her to stumble and fall hard onto the red carpet. He ignored his wife entirely and charged directly toward me. The veins in his neck bulged and spit flew from his lips as he screamed. He pointed a shaking finger an inch from my face. He shouted that I was a pathetic, jealous parasite who had just ruined my own family. He roared that this hostile takeover was a temporary, meaningless stunt. He told the entire crowd of remaining journalists that he possessed massive, untouchable assets, and he was going to hire the most vicious corporate litigators in the country to destroy Titan Holdings. Kendall leaned in close, his breath hot and ragged. He lowered his voice to a harsh, guttural growl, intending the threat for my ears alone, but the silence of the remaining crowd amplified every word. He explicitly threatened to liquidate our parents. He shouted that he still held the signed contract for the historic family estate. He promised me he would execute the cash sale of the $2 million property by the end of the business day. He swore he would use the millions generated from evicting our mother and our fragile father to fund a legal war that would keep me tied up in federal court until the day I died. He sneered, his chest heaving, proclaiming that I had played a clever trick, but he still held the ultimate trump card. He truly believed he could simply sacrifice our childhood home to buy his way out of the foreclosure. He thought his fraudulent midnight extortion of our mother was his impenetrable safety net. He stood tall, trying to reclaim a tiny fraction of his shattered dignity in front of the flashing cameras. He demanded that I take my lawyer and get off his property immediately before he called the police and had me arrested for corporate sabotage. He was making bold, aggressive promises based entirely on a foundation of sand. Kendall stood with his chest heaving, his face red with the physical exertion of his desperate threats. He truly believed he possessed the ultimate undeniable leverage. He thought the $2 million historic family estate was his personal unlimited cash machine, ready to dispense the funds he needed to wage a limitless legal war against me. He was breathing heavily, waiting for me to cower, waiting for me to realize that he had outmaneuvered me by stealing our parents' home. I did not interrupt him. I let him scream his promises of destruction into the cold morning air. When he finally ran out of breath, the only sound left in the massive white tent was the relentless, rapid clicking of the press cameras. I looked at him with absolute, profound pity. I turned to Abram and gave him a single subtle nod. Abram placed his heavy leather briefcase flat on a nearby cocktail table and unclasped the secondary interior compartment. I reached inside and pulled out a perfectly smooth, thick manila folder. I did not toss it at Kendall the way Abram had delivered the foreclosure notices to Gretchen. I held it out respectfully, offering it to him with a perfectly steady hand. Kendall stared at this folder, highly suspicious, but his immense blinding arrogance compelled him to snatch it from my grip. He ripped the folder open aggressively. Inside rested a freshly stamped, legally binding decree from the state electronic registry, along with a high-resolution certified copy of our father's original 50-year-old property deed. I watched his eyes scan the bold legal text. I began to explain the reality of his situation in a voice so calm and quiet, it forced the entire panicked crowd of investors and journalists to lean in closer just to hear my words. I told him that our parents had never held the family estate in a standard joint tenancy. I explained the strict unilateral survivorship and consent clause our father had secretly established decades ago to protect his legacy from vultures exactly like him. I informed Kendall that the predatory real estate contract he had violently forced our terrified mother to sign earlier that week was completely legally void. She did not possess the legal right or the sole authority to sell that house. The fabricated medical power of attorney he held was entirely useless against a primary, deeply entrenched property deed. Kendall's eyes darted rapidly across the pages, searching frantically for a loophole, a technicality, or a mistake that simply did not exist. I then drew his immediate attention to the second document in the folder. I told him to read the name of the new property holding entity. I announced that as of 5 o'clock this morning, the historic family estate had been permanently transferred into an irrevocable trust. I was listed as the sole absolute trustee. The house was locked away in an impenetrable legal fortress. It could never be sold, leveraged, or touched by him. He had absolutely zero equity in our parents' home. The millions of dollars he promised to use to crush me in federal court were nothing but a phantom illusion. The heavy parchment papers trembled violently in Kendall's hands. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of profound confusion and absolute dread. He tried to speak, to formulate a coherent defense, but he only managed to stammer a few broken, meaningless syllables. I did not give him a chance to recover his voice or his composure. I stepped closer to him, completely invading his physical space. I shifted my tone from calm explanation to the harsh, unforgiving delivery of a federal prosecutor delivering a closing argument. I told him that losing his massive real estate project to my private equity firm was only the financial consequence of his incredible arrogance. The folder he was currently holding represented the absolute criminal consequence. I laid out the exact parameters of the legal trap he had blindly walked into with his own 2 feet. I reminded him that he had established a shell corporation to purchase the family home. He had forced a signature on a fraudulent contract using emotional extortion. Then he had actively presented that worthless, fabricated contract as legitimate financial collateral to an underground hard money lender to secure a massive illegal loan to save his failing condominium project. I pointed out that he had transmitted these documents electronically across state lines. Abram stepped up right beside me, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting Kendall's pale, terrified face. Abram announced to the silent crowd that under strict federal law, knowingly offering property you do not legally own as collateral for a commercial loan constitutes felony real estate fraud. Furthermore, utilizing the internet or standard banking networks to transmit those fraudulent documents immediately triggers a secondary charge of federal wire fraud. Abram cited the exact federal statutes and the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines with terrifying precision. He informed Kendall that the Department of Justice does not offer favorable plea deals for men who steal from medical charity funds and actively defraud financial institutions. By attempting to evict our fragile father in the middle of the night and finalize that illicit sale, Kendall had handed the federal government a perfectly wrapped, undeniable criminal case. The hard money lenders he had tried to trick would be furious, but the federal prosecutors would be absolutely merciless. Kendall had effectively signed his own arrest warrant. The final devastating equation assembled itself perfectly inside Kendall's mind. The grand illusion of his wealth, his status, and his power instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He ran the numbers and realized the absolute horrifying truth of his existence. His luxury condominium project was completely foreclosed, legally seized by my holding company. His personal and corporate bank accounts were entirely frozen by the Federal Anti-Money Laundering Division, rendering him completely penniless and unable to hire a defense attorney. The massive GoFundMe charity money he had stolen was locked away in a federal evidence vault. The $2 million family estate he planned to sell was permanently secured in an irrevocable trust under my total control. He had absolutely zero liquid assets. He was buried under a mountain of secondary corporate liabilities and unpaid contractor invoices. And worst of all, he had just publicly committed a string of severe federal felonies that carried a mandatory sentence of at least 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He was not just bankrupt, he was completely destroyed. The psychological snap was audible. The smooth, calculating con artist died right there on the red carpet, entirely replaced by a cornered, rabid animal with nothing left to lose. He let out a primal, guttural scream of pure, unadulterated madness. He dropped the legal documents onto the concrete floor, ignoring the wind as it blew the papers across the site. He completely forgot about the flashing press cameras, the wealthy investors, and the basic rules of civilized society. He tore at his expensive silk tie, ripping it from his neck as if it were choking him. He curled his hands into tight fists, his face twisting into a hideous mask of murderous rage. He blamed me entirely for his destruction, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that his own boundless greed had built the trap from the ground up. He lunged forward with explosive, terrifying speed. He aimed his hands directly at my throat, his eyes wide with violent intent. He intended to physically tear me apart, right there in front of the entire city, determined to take me down with his sinking ship. Kendall closed the physical distance between us. In a fraction of a second, his hands hooked into violent claws aimed directly at my windpipe. I did not raise my arms to defend myself. I did not flinch, step back, or break eye contact with the madman charging toward me. I knew I was not standing alone on that red carpet. Before Kendall could even graze the fabric of my suit jacket, a massive, solid force intercepted him from the right flank. It was Bradley. My son-in-law had been standing quietly among the crowd of wealthy tech investors, having received a VIP invitation from Kendall himself earlier that week to maintain the facade of family unity. Bradley did not hesitate. He moved with the sudden, explosive kinetic energy of a man who had spent the last several days suppressing an intense, righteous fury. He drove his heavy shoulder directly into Kendall's chest, entirely disrupting my brother's forward momentum. The impact produced a loud, sickening thud that echoed over the frantic clicking of the press cameras. Kendall gasped, the air violently forced from his lungs, and stumbled backward. Bradley did not give him a chance to recover or swing back. He grabbed the lapels of Kendall's torn, expensive suit jacket, twisted his hips, and forcefully swept Kendall's legs out from under him. My brother hit the concrete foundation with a heavy, humiliating crash, entirely missing the plush red carpet. Bradley instantly dropped down, pressing his heavy knee directly into the center of Kendall's chest, pinning him flat against the hard, dusty ground. Kendall thrashed wildly like a caught fish, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple as he struggled to breathe under Bradley's massive weight. He clawed helplessly at Bradley's forearms, but the younger man did not budge an inch. Bradley leaned down his face mere inches from Kendall's ear. He did not scream or shout. He spoke in a low, furious whisper that cut right through the chaos of the crowd. He told Kendall that this concrete floor was the exact return on investment for stealing his daughter's college fund. He told him to stay perfectly still unless he wanted his jaw permanently wired shut. The hired security guards, who had been completely frozen by Abram's earlier legal threats, finally took a hesitant step forward to intervene in the physical altercation. But before the head of security could even open his mouth to issue a command, the piercing, unmistakable wail of heavy sirens shattered the morning air. The sound did not come from a single local patrol cruiser. It was a deafening, synchronized chorus of high-powered sirens rapidly approaching from the main commercial boulevard. The wealthy investors and journalists turned their heads in unison toward the perimeter fencing. 4 massive, completely black tactical SUVs tore through the main construction gate, their heavy tires kicking up massive clouds of dirt and gravel. They bypassed the designated valet parking and drove directly onto the active site, violently braking just inches from the edge of the catering tent. The doors of the vehicles flew open simultaneously. More than a dozen federal agents swarmed out. They were not wearing standard police uniforms. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their backs. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, instantly securing the perimeter of the tent and completely blocking the primary exits. The crowd of politicians and private investors instantly parted like the Red Sea, terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a massive federal raid. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with a severe military haircut, marched directly down the center of the red carpet. Kendall, still pinned to the concrete by Bradley, twisted his neck to look at the approaching officers. His delusional arrogance flared up for one final pathetic moment. He gasped for air and shouted at the lead agent, demanding that they arrest me and Bradley immediately for aggravated assault and corporate trespassing. He actually believed his own neighbors had called the local police to break up the fight, and he assumed he could manipulate the authorities exactly like he had done the night before at our parents' house. The lead federal agent did not even look at me. He stopped directly over Kendall's pinned body, pulled a heavily folded document from his jacket, and looked down with absolute disgust. He asked Bradley to step back. Bradley complied instantly, rising to his feet and stepping smoothly to my side, leaving Kendall gasping on the ground. The agent did not ask Kendall for his version of the story. He announced in a booming voice that he was executing multiple federal arrest warrants issued just an hour ago by a grand jury. He read the charges aloud for the entire press pool to hear. He cited massive interstate wire fraud, aggressive money laundering, and the malicious misappropriation of over $400,000 in registered medical charity funds. The AML fraud dossier I had anonymously submitted to his bank days ago had provided the federal government with a flawless, irrefutable roadmap to his entire criminal enterprise. The realization that the FBI was here for him and him alone finally broke the very last shred of Kendall's sanity. Two federal agents hauled Kendall roughly to his feet. They did not treat him like a respected real estate mogul. They treated him like a dangerous felon. They grabbed his wrists, twisted his arms forcefully behind his back, and secured a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The loud metallic clicking of the ratchets echoed through the silent tent. Kendall's legs gave out and the agents had to physically support his weight to keep him from collapsing back onto the concrete. The press photographers surged forward, their cameras flashing violently, capturing the absolute undeniable destruction of the golden child in high definition. Kendall wildly turned his head, desperately searching the crowd for his wife. He spotted Gretchen standing near the overturned cocktail tables. He cried out her name, begging her to call their elite private attorneys, begging her to tell the federal agents that this was all a massive misunderstanding. Gretchen looked at her husband, looked at the handcuffs, and looked at the stern faces of the FBI agents. Survival is a vicious, entirely selfish instinct in people who lack a moral compass. Gretchen did not run to his side. She violently backed away from him, her face contorting into a theatrical mask of absolute horror and victimhood. She screamed at the top of her lungs, waving her hands wildly in the air. She shouted to the press and the federal agents that she had absolutely no idea what her husband was doing. She lied flawlessly, claiming Kendall had completely manipulated her, forged her signatures, and kept her entirely in the dark regarding the finances of the condominium project. She publicly abandoned him in a fraction of a second, ready to throw him into the federal wood chipper if it meant saving her own luxurious lifestyle. She turned her back on her weeping husband and attempted to quickly blend into the crowd of fleeing investors to escape the perimeter. But Abram was already standing directly in her escape path. He did not let her take another step. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a secondary thick legal envelope. He pressed it firmly into her chest, forcing her to take it. He smiled his cold, predatory smile and informed her that playing the victim does not work when your exact legal signature is listed as a primary managing director on the fraudulent shell company's tax returns. He loudly announced that she had just been served with a federal subpoena for corporate complicity, criminal conspiracy, and joint tax evasion. Gretchen stared at the heavy envelope in her hands, her screams instantly catching in her throat. She looked at Kendall being dragged toward the back of the black SUVs, and then she looked directly at me. They were both completely trapped, permanently bound together in the inescapable legal chains they had forged entirely with their own boundless greed. I simply adjusted my suit jacket, stood shoulder to shoulder with my son-in-law, and watched them fall. The dust settled over the city, but the shockwaves of that Friday morning continued to tear through the remnants of my brother's life with absolute unforgiving precision. It has been 6 weeks since the federal raid at the Riverwalk construction site. Kendall is currently sitting in a maximum security federal detention center, entirely stripped of his tailored suits, his expensive watches, and his unearned arrogance. His urgent request for bail was unequivocally denied by the presiding judge due to the overwhelming flight risk and the sheer undeniable volume of his financial crimes. He is awaiting trial in a small concrete cell, and his exhausted public defender has already informed him that the Department of Justice is seeking a mandatory minimum of 15 years. Gretchen did not fare any better. Her desperate attempt to play the victim collapsed the very moment federal investigators audited her brother's shell corporation. They discovered her signature clearly printed on multiple fraudulent tax returns and illicit bank transfers. The federal government seized all of her personal assets, completely bankrupting her family and leaving them with absolutely nothing but massive legal debts. She is currently living in a cramped, miserable apartment facing her own impending federal indictment for corporate complicity. But the most difficult consequence of the fallout did not happen in a sterile courtroom. It happened right here in the quiet parlor of the historic family estate. Yesterday afternoon, my mother Martha came to visit. She did not come to apologize for signing the fraudulent contract that nearly cost my father his life. She came to beg. She sat on the antique velvet sofa weeping loudly and pleaded with me to contact the federal prosecutors. She asked me to drop the charges, claiming that Kendall had simply made a terrible mistake under pressure and that family should always forgive family. I sat across from her and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no resentment, just a profound, freezing clarity. I told her that federal wire fraud and elder abuse are not simple mistakes. I explained that I did not press the criminal charges the United States government did, and I possessed no power to stop the legal avalanche Kendall had started himself. But even if I could stop it, I told her I would not lift a single finger to save him. She looked at me as if I were a monster. I did not care. I stood up, walked to the heavy front door, and opened it wide. I told my mother that the era of my silent compliance was permanently over. I established a firm, unbreakable boundary right then and there. I told her she was always welcome to visit my father, but if she ever mentioned Kendall's name in my presence again, I would permanently bar her from the property. She left in total silence, finally understanding that the compliant, invisible older brother was truly dead. With the toxic elements of my family entirely removed, I focused my absolute attention on repairing the deep financial damage they had inflicted on the people who actually mattered. As the sole executive owner of Titan Holdings, I possess the absolute legal right to liquidate the assets of the defaulted condominium project. I did not want to become a commercial real estate developer. I wanted clean, untraceable cash. Abram negotiated the rapid, highly profitable sale of the concrete foundation, the steel permits, and the prime commercial land to a massive, legitimate international development firm. The rapid sale generated millions of dollars in pure, unencumbered profit. My very first act as the victor was to immediately repair the theft my brother had committed against his own blood. I transferred the stolen $85,000 directly back into my granddaughter's educational trust. But I did not stop there. I added a massive secondary deposit, entirely funded by the liquidation of Kendall's fraudulent empire. I secured her university tuition, her housing, and her financial independence for the next decade. I restored the stolen money tenfold, exactly as I had promised in that dingy motel room weeks ago. Last Sunday, I invited Sasha and Bradley to the family estate for a celebratory dinner. There was no underlying tension, no fake smiles, and absolutely no emotional manipulation. The atmosphere was light, authentic, and filled with genuine warmth. After dinner, Bradley and I walked out to the sprawling backyard. We stood in the cool evening breeze, looking out over the manicured lawn. He did not apologize again for his previous angry outburst, and I did not ask him to. We both understood the heavy, necessary truth of what we had accomplished together in the dark. Without his technical brilliance and his willingness to cross the line to hack the router, the heist at the dinner party would have failed entirely. And without my ruthless financial strategy, his daughter would have lost her entire future. We did not exchange a long, emotional speech. We simply turned to each other and shared a silent, profound look of absolute mutual respect. He knew exactly what kind of man I was, and I knew exactly how far he would go to protect his family. He offered his hand. I shook it firmly. The bond between us was no longer built on polite, fragile family obligations. It was forged in the fire of absolute war, and it was entirely unbreakable. The sun is currently rising over the historic family estate, casting a warm, golden glow across the massive oak trees. I am sitting in a heavy wooden rocking chair on the wraparound porch. The morning air is crisp and clean, entirely devoid of the suffocating tension that used to haunt this beautiful property. The dull, persistent ache in my left side from the kidney extraction has finally faded into a faint, barely noticeable memory. My physical strength has fully returned, but more importantly, my spirit is completely unburdened. The heavy wooden front door creaks open behind me. My father, Ellis, steps out onto the porch. He is not sitting in a cheap transport wheelchair, and he is not looking over his shoulder in sheer terror. He walks slowly but steadily, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane. The healthy color has returned to his face and his eyes are incredibly bright and focused. The transplanted kidney is functioning perfectly, granting him a vibrant, healthy extension of his life that Kendall had so desperately tried to monetize and destroy. My father sits down carefully in the rocking chair right next to mine. He does not speak. He does not need to. We have shared more profound truth in our silence over the past few weeks than our family has spoken in 4 decades. I hand him a steaming ceramic mug of black coffee. He takes it with a steady hand, takes a slow sip, and lets out a long, contented sigh. I take a sip of my own coffee and look out over the sprawling green lawn. I spent my entire life believing that sacrifice was the ultimate measure of a man's worth. I thought that by giving away pieces of myself, whether it was my money, my pride, or my literal organs, I could eventually earn the respect of the people who shared my blood. I was completely wrong. Sacrifice without boundaries is simply slow suicide. I look at my father alive and breathing quietly beside me. I gave away my left kidney, and it successfully saved a life. But I had to use my brain, my absolute ruthlessness, and my unyielding demand for respect to secure our permanent freedom. I am Conrad. I am 69 years old, and my ledger is finally balanced. I also learned that silence should never be mistaken for submission. Predators often mistake a calm demeanor for weakness, assuming that because you do not scream, you cannot fight. But true power does not need to announce its arrival. It waits, observes, and calculates. By allowing my family to believe they had broken me, I gained the ultimate advantage. They defeated themselves with their own blinding arrogance. Do not let anyone weaponize your love or sacrifice against you. Protecting your peace sometimes requires destroying the illusions of those who seek to exploit your inherent goodness and your quiet, enduring patience. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect yourself from toxic family members? Share your own experiences in the comments below. If you found strength in this story, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another life lesson. Thank you for watching, and remember to always protect your peace.